The morning Amara Osei discovered she was pregnant, she was standing in the narrow bathroom of a rented room that smelled of damp plaster and old wood. The test strip in her hand showed 2 clear lines. She stared at it for a long time without moving. Outside the frosted window, a bus rumbled past, and a child somewhere in the building began to cry. She set the strip carefully on the edge of the sink, washed her hands twice, and then sat down on the cold floor with her back against the wall. She did not cry. She did not make a sound. She simply sat there, her arms folded across her knees, staring at the cracked tile in front of her, thinking about the river back home. She had grown up beside a river in a small town in the west of the country. The town was called Thornwell. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the baker knew your grandmother's name, where news spread before it even had a chance to happen. The river ran along the eastern edge of town, wide and slow and brown in summer, gray and fast in winter. As a child, Amara had spent whole afternoons sitting on its bank, watching the water move, thinking about all the places it was going that she was not. Her father, George Osei, had been a school teacher for 31 years. He taught geography and mathematics at the only secondary school in Thornwell, and he was the kind of teacher that students remembered long after they had forgotten everything he had taught them. He was patient and precise, and he had a way of making the hardest problem seem like something that simply needed a little more time and a little more attention. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who gave up. Her mother, Clara, was a seamstress. She worked from the front room of their house, which smelled always of fabric and iron, and the faint sweetness of the tea she kept perpetually warm on a small table beside her sewing machine. Clara had fast hands and a slow smile. She mended things, clothes, curtains, the torn hems of other people's lives, and she did it all with a quiet steadiness that Amara had spent her whole childhood trying to understand, and her whole adulthood trying to copy. They were not wealthy, they were not poor. They lived in a house that was clean and a little crowded, with a garden where her father grew tomatoes and her mother grew herbs, and a front door that was always unlocked until 10 o'clock at night. Amara had one younger brother, Samuel, who was studying engineering at a polytechnic in the north, and who called home every Sunday at noon without fail. Amara had been the exceptional one. She had known it not because anyone said so, but because of the way her teachers paused when they handed back her work, the way they wrote longer comments in the margins of her essays than they did for anyone else. She stayed late in the school library until the caretaker chased her out. She asked questions in class that sometimes made her teachers go quiet and think before answering. When she was 17, a letter arrived at the house in Thornwell that changed everything. It was from the Calvert Foundation, a national scholarship program that awarded full university scholarships to outstanding students from underserved communities. Amara had applied on the advice of her father, who had found the form tucked inside a teaching newsletter and filled it out himself before he even told her about it. The letter said she had been selected. It said her tuition, housing, and living expenses would be covered for the full duration of her undergraduate studies at Beaumont University, one of the country's most prestigious institutions. Her mother read the letter 3 times. Her father sat at the kitchen table and said nothing for several minutes. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and stood there looking at the garden. When he turned around, his eyes were wet. He did not say anything. He did not have to. Beaumont University was everything Thornwell was not. It was in the capital, a city that moved at a speed Amara found overwhelming for the first several weeks. The campus was old and grand, with stone buildings and wide courtyards and lecture halls that could seat 500 people. Students walked in groups across lawns that were greener than anything she had seen, talking loudly about things she had only read about. Cafes stayed open past midnight. The library had 7 floors. She arrived in September with 2 suitcases and a determination she kept tucked so deep inside herself that it barely showed on her face. She was quiet in her first weeks. Not shy, exactly. More watchful. She listened to the conversations around her and learned the grammar of this new world before she tried to speak it. She noticed who sat where, who laughed the loudest, who asked the questions in lectures, and who only ever answered them. She had been assigned a room in Caldwell Hall, one of the older residential buildings on the east side of campus. Her roommate was a girl named Petra, who was from a city in the north, and who decorated every surface with photographs, and who played music at a volume that required negotiation. They were not close, but they were kind to each other, which Amara had learned early was often more useful. She studied economics. She had chosen it because she believed that understanding money was understanding power, and understanding power was understanding the world. She attended every lecture. She took notes in 2 notebooks, one for what was said and one for what she thought about what was said. Her tutors noticed. Her marks in the first semester were the highest in her cohort, a fact she discovered only when the results were posted on a board in the economics building, and a girl standing beside her said, quietly, "Someone got 94%. That's unheard of." Amara looked at the board. She looked at the name beside the highest mark. She looked at the floor. Then she walked back to her room and called her father, who listened to her tell him her results in a steady voice, and then said, in the soft, careful way he had of saying important things, "Good. Now do it again." She did. By the middle of her first year, she had found a rhythm. She had found a small group of people she trusted, not friends, in the loud, easy sense, but people she could sit beside in the library and eat with in the dining hall, without pretending to be someone she was not. There was Oliver, who studied history and who always had 3 books under his arm. There was Nadia, who was studying law and who spoke so fast that Amara had to concentrate to follow her. There was Henry, who was quiet and funny, in a way that only became apparent the more time you spent with him. She had not expected to like any of them as quickly as she did, but there was something about being far from home that loosened certain things in people, that made them quicker to be honest, quicker to show what they actually were, because there was no family nearby to perform for. And then, in her second semester, she met Darian Cole. She met him at a lecture series held in the Beaumont Great Hall, a series of talks by industry professionals that the economics department organized each spring. He was sitting 2 rows ahead of her. He turned around to find somewhere to put his coat, and his eyes landed on the empty seat beside her. He raised an eyebrow. She nodded. He sat down. He was tall and lean with dark eyes, and an ease about him that was immediately visible, the kind of ease that came not from effort, but from a lifetime of having rooms arrange themselves around you. He wore clothes that were quietly expensive, in the way that only expensive clothes manage. He had a way of listening to a speaker that looked like genuine interest, rather than the performance of it. He introduced himself during the break between talks. He asked her name, and then said it back to her correctly on the first try, which she noticed, because most people didn't. He asked what she was studying, and then asked a real question about it, not the polite, vague question that people asked when they didn't actually care. "You think demand forecasting in developing markets is underrepresented in mainstream economic modeling," he said, repeating something she had said. "That's interesting. I've never heard a first-year say something like that." "I've never been to a first-year lecture," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh. They talked for the entire second half of the series, through 2 more speakers, through a reception with wine and small sandwiches, through the slow emptying of the hall. By the time they walked out into the dark spring evening, she knew that something had shifted. She did not name it yet. She was careful with naming things. He asked for her number. She gave it. He texted her the same night, a short message that said only, "Good conversation. Same time next week?" She had read it twice, and put her phone down, and gone back to her reading. But she had smiled. She had not meant to. She had. In the weeks that followed, she and Darian began spending time together in the careful, cautious way that people do when they are not yet sure what they are doing, but know they want to keep doing it. They met for coffee in the mornings before lectures. They walked across the campus in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his family, his father, who ran a financial consultancy, his mother, who sat on several charity boards, his 2 older sisters who had both attended Beaumont before him. He listened to her too, or he seemed to. He asked questions, and nodded at the answers, and remembered details she had mentioned only once. He was good at making her feel heard, and she had not been expecting that. She was aware, even early on, of the difference between their lives. He came from a world she had only ever read about. Dinners at restaurants whose names she recognized from newspaper columns, summer houses, school friends whose fathers were in government. She came from Thornwell, and a house with a garden full of tomatoes, and a mother who mended other people's clothes. She did not pretend otherwise. She did not dress it up or dress it down. When he asked her about her background, she told him plainly. He listened without flinching, which she respected. She did not yet know how little that meant. By the time summer came and students began to leave the campus for the holidays, they were together in the way that two people are when they have not said the words yet, but have long since passed the point where they needed to. He had kissed her once, beside the stone bridge on the south side of campus, on a cold evening when the trees were losing their last leaves. It was a quiet, careful thing, and he had pulled back afterwards and looked at her with an expression she did not entirely know how to read. She went home to Thornwell for the summer. She helped her mother in the front room, pinning fabric and threading needles, and listening to the rhythm of the machine. She helped her father mark papers he had brought home from school. She sat by the river in the evenings and felt the particular kind of longing that only distance can produce. Not longing for a place, but for the version of yourself that exists in a place. She thought about Darian. She thought about what was beginning and what it might become. She thought, too, about the parts of it that didn't quite fit. The moments when he had steered a conversation away from her, when he had failed to introduce her to someone they had walked past, when she had caught him looking at her in a way that seemed, just briefly, calculating. She told herself she was imagining it. That was the mistake. When she returned to Beaumont in September, everything had settled into something that felt more certain. They were openly together now. He called her every morning. He cooked dinner for her in his room on Sundays. He bought her small gifts, a book, a scarf, once a very small potted plant that she kept on her windowsill and watered obsessively. He made her laugh. That was the thing she would remember longest, and the thing that made everything harder. He was genuinely funny, in the dry, offhand way that sneaks up on you. She laughed with him more than she laughed with anyone else, and that made her trust him in ways she perhaps shouldn't have. What she did not see, or did not allow herself to see, was the pattern that was forming underneath the warmth. The way he never brought her to the dinners his friends organized on the weekends. The way, when she met his older sister once on campus, he introduced her vaguely as a friend from the economics department. The way he had, once, when she was standing right beside him, told someone on the phone that he was not really seeing anyone seriously at the moment. She had heard that. She had not mentioned it. She had filed it carefully in the back of her mind, with all the other things she was not yet ready to look at directly. Her second year at Beaumont was her academically strongest. She was named to the faculty's academic honor list. She was asked to assist one of her professors with research. She presented a short paper at an undergraduate symposium that received genuine attention from the faculty in the room. Her scholarship was renewed without question. George and Clara Osei drove up from Thornwell for the end-of-year reception and sat in the front row of the room where she received her certificate and clapped in the way that parents clap. Too loud, too long, and with everything they have. Darian did not come to that reception. He had mentioned it, and she had invited him, and he had said he would try. He had not tried. She had stood beside her parents in the courtyard afterwards and smiled for photographs and eaten the small celebration cake her mother had brought in a box, and she had not mentioned him. Her father had not asked. Her mother had looked at her once, with the look that mothers have, the one that sees everything and says nothing, and then she had wrapped her arms around Amara and held on for a moment longer than usual. The train ride back to Thornwell that evening was quiet. George sat across from her and read a newspaper. Clara knitted. Amara looked out the window at the dark countryside and felt, beneath the pride and the warmth of the day, a small, cold thing beginning to solidify. She had not named it yet, but it was there. She had never told anyone exactly what the train journey felt like that first time. Not her parents, not Oliver or Nadia, not anyone who asked her what it was like to leave Thornwell for the capital. She had described the practical things, the 2 suitcases, the scholarship money deposited into her account the week before, the fact that she had checked the route 4 times and still arrived at the station 40 minutes early just in case. She described the train and the seat and the sandwich she had packed in a bag her mother had pressed on her at the door. What she did not describe was the feeling of watching the countryside change outside the window, the wide-open fields of the west giving way to the denser, flatter land of the Midlands, the industrial outskirts of smaller cities, the gradual thickening of the landscape as the capital grew closer. More roads, more buildings, more structures stacked against each other, until the green disappeared entirely, and the window showed only the city, enormous and indifferent, and full of people who did not know she was coming. She had felt very small, not frightened, not uncertain in the deep sense, just very small. And she had thought about her father's advice, which was always the same advice regardless of the subject. Pay attention to what is actually happening, not to what you think might happen. What was actually happening was that she was on a train. She would arrive at the station. She would find the university, which she had memorized in a map app on her phone, and which was not difficult to reach from the central station. She would find her accommodation. She would unpack. She would be fine. The smallness was just geography. She had been right. She had arrived, and she had found her room, and she had unpacked with the systematic efficiency that her mother had always applied to the front room after a heavy week of sewing, and she had placed everything in its place. And then she had sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room, and looked at the wall, and breathed very carefully for approximately 2 minutes. Then she had opened her economics textbook and read the first chapter. Her first friend at Beaumont had not been Oliver, or Nadia, or Henry. Her first friend had been a maintenance worker named Phil, who had been fixing a radiator in the corridor outside her room, on her third day, when she came back from the library at 9 in the evening. He was 60-something, from the east end of the city originally, and he had been maintaining the heating at Beaumont for 11 years, and had opinions about everything, and was not in any way impressed by the institution he worked in, which she found refreshing. He had asked her, that first evening, what she was studying. When she told him economics, he had said, "Right. So you're going to learn how to explain why everything costs what it costs." She had said she supposed that was part of it. He had said, "Good. Because I've been wanting to know why a cup of tea in this place costs £3.50 since 2014. She had laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since arriving. Phil had told her about the campus, not the official version in the welcome pack, but the real version, where the good food was, and where the quiet study rooms were that the second and third years didn't know about, and where you could get a very good cup of tea for £1.20 if you walked to the building on the north side that the catering contractor forgot about on their pricing review. She had taken notes. She had thought about Phil many times in the years since, about how arrival in a new place was really a series of small, accidental conversations that taught you how to live in it, and how the person who most helped her understand Beaumont had been fixing a radiator in a corridor. It was that thought, held and examined over time, that had eventually shaped the research question at the center of her dissertation. The people who most determined access in any system were rarely the people who appeared to be in charge of it. The credit officer in the bank, the person who processed the application, the maintenance worker who told you which door to use. Knowledge moved sideways through systems, through unexpected conversations, through the networks that official channels didn't see. Understanding that was understanding everything. She had written 600 words about this one afternoon, in her room at Caldwell Hall, and then looked at what she had written, and understood that she had found her question. In Thornwell, sitting on the bathroom floor with 2 lines on a test strip, she did not know yet that the same principle was going to apply to everything that was coming next, that the most important things would not arrive through the channels she was watching, but through the side doors, the unexpected turnings, the knock of an elbow at a gala that sent a clipboard skidding across polished stone. She got up off the floor. She made herself tea. She went to the seminar. Outside the window of the seminar room, the city moved at its ordinary pace. Buses and cars and people with their heads down, each of them in the middle of something, each of them part of something larger that they could not see entirely from where they were standing. She looked at the notes on her desk. She looked at the window. She thought about the river in Thornwell and the fast water in May. She picked up her pen. Amara returned to Beaumont in September of her 3rd year, with the kind of quiet, focused energy that comes from having decided something, without fully admitting it to yourself yet. She had not broken up with Darian over the summer. She had not confronted him. She had simply observed, from a careful distance, the space between what he said and what he did. She had stored what she found there, and said nothing. That was her way. She understood things completely before she spoke about them. The campus looked the same, the stone buildings, the green lawns, the smell of old books and autumn air, and coffee from the kiosks near the main gate. But something in her relationship to it had changed. She walked through it now with a confidence she had earned rather than performed. She knew the faces, she knew the rhythms. She belonged here, in a way she had not been sure of 2 years earlier. and that certainty changed the way she held herself. Darian was back too. He had spent the summer at his family's house in the countryside and had returned to campus tanned and relaxed, and talking about a trip to the south of France with friends she had never met. He hugged her when he saw her, kissed her cheek, told her she looked well. She looked at him carefully, the way she now looked at most things, and smiled and asked about France. In the first weeks of term, things between them were easy. He made plans, kept them. He cooked the Sunday dinners. He called in the mornings. She told herself the discomfort she felt was old and should be let go, that she had been unfair in her suspicions, that not every gap was a sign. But by the fourth week of term, the pattern returned. It was always small things: a gathering at a friend's apartment where she was not invited, a dinner with his family, where he gave her a date, then quietly moved it, then did not mention it again. A party on a Saturday night where she arrived to find him already there, already deep in a group of people she did not recognize, and the look on his face when he saw her, a flash of something that was not quite welcome and was gone too fast to name. She noticed. She always noticed. She simply had not yet decided what to do with what she noticed. She threw herself into her work. Her dissertation research was on informal economies and access to credit in low-income urban communities, a subject that felt deeply personal, even when she framed it in the dry, precise language of academic economics. Her supervisor, a serious woman named Dr. Calloway, who had published 3 books and did not waste words, told her in October that the draft chapters she had submitted were among the best undergraduate work I have reviewed in recent years. Amara sat with that compliment for a moment, then nodded, then asked what needed to be better. It was Oliver who first said what everyone around her was already thinking. Oliver, her friend from the first year, the one who always carried too many books, had known her long enough to say things directly. They were sitting in the campus cafe one afternoon in November, both of them surrounded by papers, both of them pretending to work, when he put down his pen and looked at her. "Are you happy with Darian?" he said, not as an accusation, just as a question. She looked up. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've known you for 2 years, and I've met him maybe 4 times. And every time I mention his name, you get a look on your face, like you're trying to solve a maths problem." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's complicated." Oliver picked up his pen. Most things that are called complicated are actually very simple. It's just that simple answers are harder to live with. She thought about that for a long time afterwards. She thought about it on the walk back to her room. She thought about it in the library. She thought about it lying in bed that night, listening to the quiet of the corridor outside, and she understood that Oliver was right, and that she had known he was right before he said it, and that this was the problem. Not that she didn't know the truth, but that she had been waiting for the right moment to let herself know it. The right moment arrived in December. It arrived in the form of a Christmas dinner, organized by a group of students in the economics and business departments, held in a hired room above a pub near the university. It was the kind of event that everyone attended and nobody really organized. Loud music, too much food, fairy lights strung between the beams, everyone pretending to be more festive than they were. Darian had told her about the dinner. He had said he would meet her there. He had said 7 o'clock. She arrived at 7, wearing a dark green dress she had borrowed from Nadia, and her only good earrings. She found a table with Oliver and Henry, and Nadia, and some others. She ordered a drink, and waited. He arrived at 8:15. He was with a group of people she had never seen before, 3 men and 2 women, all of them loud and at ease with each other in the way of people who had known each other since they were children. He scanned the room, saw her, and raised a hand in a half wave. Then he was absorbed back into his group. He did not come over. She watched him across the room for the better part of an hour. She watched him laugh, refill drinks, put his arm around one of the men in his group. She watched him exist in a world that did not have a space for her in it. She kept her face completely still. She talked to Nadia about a case they'd been discussing in Nadia's contract law class. She ate the food that was brought to the table. She stayed for 2 hours. She left at 10. She said goodnight to her friends, collected her coat, and walked out into the cold December air. She stood on the pavement for a moment, breathing. The city was full of its usual noise: taxis, music from somewhere, voices. She started walking back toward the campus. Her phone buzzed. A message from Darian. "Leaving soon. Are you still here?" She looked at the message. She put her phone in her coat pocket and kept walking. She did not respond that night, or the next morning, or the day after that. She had not made a decision yet, but she had stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. That was the first step. He called on the third day. She answered. "You disappeared," he said. "I left," she said. "I was there for 2 hours. You didn't come over once." There was a pause. "I was with people. I was going to come over. I got caught up." "You got caught up," she repeated. Not accusatory, just precise. "Amara, don't make something out of nothing." "I'm not making anything," she said. "I'm just telling you what happened." The conversation that followed was the kind that doesn't resolve anything, but clarifies everything. He apologized in the vague, ambient way of someone who wants the apology to be received without the accompanying admission of fault. She accepted it in the way of someone who has learned that some apologies are just pause buttons rather than endings. They continued, but something had been said, even if not in words. The Christmas holidays came. She went home to Thornwell and did not tell her parents about any of it. She helped her mother. She helped her father. She sat by the river, in the cold December air, with her coat pulled close, and watched the water, and thought about what she wanted her life to look like, not in 10 years but right now, this year, this season. She thought about the kind of love she had always imagined for herself. Not extravagant, not dramatic, just honest. Just someone who chose her plainly, and without conditions. She thought about whether Darian was that person, and she could not make the answer come out the way she wanted it to. She returned to Beaumont in January, with a kind of inner quiet that people sometimes mistook for sadness, but was actually the precursor to a decision. She was nearly through with the waiting. She could feel it. And then, on a wet January evening, she attended the Beaumont Alumni and Industry Gala, an annual event held in the Grand Hall of the main administrative building, and everything began to change. She had been asked to help coordinate the event as part of a student committee she had been involved with since her second year. It was not glamorous work. She spent most of the evening with a clipboard, directing caterers, checking name tags, managing a queue of alumni who all seemed to have misplaced their invitations. She was wearing a plain black dress and flat shoes, and her hair was pulled back, which was how she always wore it when she was working rather than attending. She had been crossing the entrance lobby at a pace that left no room for anything to interrupt her when she collided with someone coming around a corner from the opposite direction. His elbow caught her clipboard and sent it skidding across the polished floor. Her pen rolled under a chair. She stopped and looked up. He was not particularly tall. He had dark brown hair that was slightly longer than was fashionable, and he was wearing a suit that was good but not showy. He had a face that was easy to look at, not in a striking way, not in the way that made you catch your breath, but in the way of a face that seemed to have arrived at its expression through experience rather than effort. He looked, in that first moment, slightly startled, and then immediately sorry. "I'm so sorry," he said. He bent down and picked up her clipboard before she could reach it, then retrieved her pen from under the chair. He handed both back to her. "Thank you," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." She was already recalculating her route, already thinking about the queue at the name tag table. "Excuse me." "Of course." She was 3 steps away when she heard him say, "Is there a program for the evening? I don't think I was given one." She stopped, turned, looked at him again. He was holding up empty hands to demonstrate the absence of a program, and the gesture was so simple and direct that it made her almost smile. She found him a program. She pointed out where the drinks were being served and where the speakers would be. He thanked her again. She nodded and went back to her clipboard. She thought nothing more of it for the next hour and a half. Then, during the interval between the second and third speakers, when she had a brief 15 minutes of nothing to manage, she found herself standing near one of the tall windows at the side of the hall with a glass of water, watching the room. She saw him standing a few feet away, also not quite part of any group, also just watching. He noticed her at the same moment. He lifted his glass slightly, in the kind of acknowledgement that requires no commitment. She lifted hers back. He crossed the room. Not quickly, not with the deliberate confidence of someone who assumes their approach will be welcome, just steadily. "Are you on duty for the rest of the evening?" he said. "Another hour," she said. "Then I won't keep you." But he didn't move. He said, "I heard the second speaker mention informal economy modeling. Is that your area?" She looked at him. "How did you know I was an economist?" You have 2 pens behind your ear, and an event program with margin notes on the back. You're not a law student. They annotate the front. She looked at her program. She had indeed written 3 notes in the margins. She had not been aware that was visible from the outside. It's my dissertation area, she said. What's your specific focus? Credit access in low-income urban economies. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who is actually thinking about what you've said, rather than preparing their next sentence. That's a gap in the literature, he said. That's why I chose it, she said. What's the constraint? The credit gap, I mean. Is it supply side, lenders not lending, or demand side, people not applying? Both, she said. But the demand side barrier is underestimated. If you've been told your whole life that certain things aren't for you, you stop trying to access them. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. That's true of more than credit. She didn't know why that particular sentence stayed with her for so long afterwards. It was not remarkable on its own, but something in the way he said it, without performance, without trying to impress her, just as a simple observation that he happened to believe, made it feel more honest than anything she had heard in a long time. They talked until her 15 minutes became 20, and then 25, and then one of the other student organizers came to find her, and she excused herself and went back to work. She didn't get his name. She didn't ask. She did not know yet that she would spend the next several months thinking about that conversation, returning to it like you return to a sentence in a book that keeps meaning something different each time. That came later. First, there was everything that still had to fall apart. She returned to Darian. She went back to the careful, watchful routine of their relationship. She told herself the conversation at the gala was nothing, a brief, pleasant exchange with a stranger, and that the feeling it had left her with was simply a reminder of what an honest conversation felt like, and that she should expect more of that from Darian, and that perhaps that was the conversation she needed to have. She had that conversation, in February, on a Sunday evening in his room, with the rain against the window, and the smell of the dinner he had cooked still in the air. She asked him plainly, what were they? Where were they going? Did he see her as someone who was part of his life, or someone who existed alongside it? He looked at her with an expression she had seen before, but had never named until that moment. It was the expression of someone deciding how much to give away. He said the things that people say when they mean something else. He said they were good together. He said timing was complicated. He said she was asking for a kind of certainty that no one could give at their age. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his hand was warm and familiar, and she let him hold it, and hated herself a little for letting him. She left that evening without an answer. She went back to her room and opened her dissertation and stared at the screen for a long time. Then she closed her laptop and sat in the dark and thought, with a clarity she had been avoiding for too long, that the person she was in this relationship was not the person she wanted to be. But she stayed, a little longer, as people do. What she had never told Darian, and what she had told no one, was that she had known from the 3rd month that she was more serious about him than he was about her. She had known it the way she knew things she didn't want to know, quietly, peripherally, the way you see something in your side vision that you turn your head slightly to avoid looking at directly. She had not ended it because of a theory she had developed during her first year at Beaumont, through observation, rather than any particular experience. The theory was that people showed you who they were not in how they treated you when things were good, but in small, incremental choices that happened so regularly they became invisible. What you had to do was keep a complete and honest account and be willing to total it up when the time came. She had been keeping the account for 2 years. She had known, from around month 4, that the total was going in a direction she didn't want. She had stayed for nearly 2 more years. She examined this later, not self-critically. Self-criticism was not useful and she had never had patience for it, but with genuine curiosity. What had kept her was not love exactly, and not comfort exactly. What had kept her was the belief, held quietly and without being fully examined, that if she was patient enough, and honest enough, and clear enough in what she wanted, she could bring the relationship up to the level of what she felt it could be. That she could, by being completely herself, make him see what was possible. This was, she understood later, the only truly naive thing she had ever believed. Not naive in the way of stupidity, but in the way of intelligence, applied to the wrong problem. You couldn't think someone into treating you properly. Either they did or they didn't. and what determined it had nothing to do with what you offered. She had learned this at 21. She had needed it understood by 22. The timing was, in retrospect, close enough. Oliver had told her once, in the way he had of saying important things in the middle of conversations about something else, that he thought the saddest version of intelligence was the kind that could explain everything except when to stop. She had thought he was talking about academic perfectionism at the time. She had not connected it to herself until much later. The cafe near the main gate was called Rafferty's, and it had been the same management and the same slightly worn furniture for longer than any of the current students had been alive. Amara had gone there for 3 years, always the same table near the window, because it was the corner of the window that caught the morning light for exactly 2 hours. She had studied there, read there, eaten breakfast there on more mornings than she could count. It was one of the places at Beaumont that she had claimed entirely for herself, the way you claim certain places in a new city as yours, before they can belong to anyone else. When she met Edward there on that first Thursday in March, she had not thought about the fact that she was bringing him to a place she already knew was hers. She had chosen it because it was practical, near the gate, easy to find, not too loud. She had not thought about what it meant that the table by the window was her table. She thought about it afterwards, the way he had already ordered when she arrived and had chosen the seat she would have chosen. The way the light came in, and he had not remarked on it, had not made an event of the light, but had simply sat in it, the way you sit in a place that feels naturally right for sitting. She had not thought about it at the time. She was thinking about it now, sitting on the bathroom floor, 3 weeks pregnant, with 2 lines on a strip of plastic. She was thinking about all the moments she had not fully considered in the moment, and was considering now in their full clarity and sequence. She understood that the account she had been keeping was not only about Darian. She had been keeping a second account, without meaning to, for nearly a year. That account told a simpler story. She looked at it now, completely and honestly, for the first time. She got up off the floor. She made tea. She went to her seminar. She was going to handle this, as she handled everything, fully, correctly, in the right order. Starting with today and building forward. The message arrived on a Wednesday morning in early March. It was not from Darian. It was not from anyone she knew. It came from an email address she did not recognize, with a name she had not seen before. Edward Ashworth. The subject line said only, an unfinished conversation. She opened it at her desk in the library, between 2 stacks of books she had been working through since 8 in the morning. She read it twice. He had been at the gala in January, he wrote. They had spoken briefly during the interval. She had been coordinating the event. He hoped she did not mind him reaching out through the university alumni office, which had been willing to forward a message to her on his behalf. He had thought about the conversation for several weeks. He found that he would like to continue it, if she was willing. He was in the city on the last Thursday of each month for professional meetings. He would be glad to buy her a coffee. Or not, if she would rather not. He would entirely understand. She read it a 3rd time. It was the most carefully written email she had ever received. Not in a formal, stiff way, but in the way of someone who had thought about what they wanted to say before they said it, who had considered how it would be received, who had been precise without being cold. She noticed that he had given her a clear and easy way to say no. She noticed that he had not assumed. She sat with it for a day before she replied. She thought about Darian. She thought about the Sunday conversation in February, and the warm hand, and the answer that wasn't an answer. She thought about what she was and wasn't allowed to want. She thought about the man at the gala, his unremarkable suit, his particular quality of attention, the sentence about credit access that had stayed with her for 2 months. She wrote back. She said yes to the coffee. She said the last Thursday of the month was a lecture-free afternoon for her. She said she would meet him at the small cafe, near the main gate of the campus at 2:30. She did not tell Darian. She told herself there was nothing to tell. It was coffee with an alumnus. She was a student who sometimes met with alumni through the university's professional networking program. It was not unusual. She was not doing anything wrong. She believed this, and did not entirely believe it, and went to meet him anyway. He was already there when she arrived, 5 minutes early, sitting at a table near the window, with 2 cups already ordered. He stood when he saw her come in, which was the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that she had not been on the receiving end of in a long time, and which she found, against her expectations, not awkward, but simply nice. He looked different outside the context of the gala, less formal, more ordinary. in a way she found more comfortable. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and a blue shirt, no tie. He smiled when she sat down, and it was a straightforward smile without performance behind it. "I wasn't certain you'd come," he said. "I said I would," she said. "People say things and change their minds. It's reasonable. I don't usually change my mind once I've said something," she told him. He looked at her as though he found this interesting, rather than blunt. "No, I didn't think you would." They talked for 2 hours. She noticed, later, that she could not have said exactly what they talked about, not because it was unmemorable, but because it was too layered to summarize. They talked about her research. They talked about the city, about things they had both noticed about the way the city worked, the parts that were visible and the parts that were not. They talked about reading. He had read widely, and she had read everything, and they discovered, somewhere in the middle of the second cup of coffee, that they had both read the same small, unfashionable book about the economics of language, and both thought it was the most interesting book they had read in years, and neither of them had ever met anyone else who had heard of it. She asked him what he did. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before he answered. "Estate management," he said, "and some board work." She nodded, and did not press. She had learned early in life that people who did not want to be impressive about their professions were usually either very modest or very self-aware, and both of those things were interesting. He asked her what she planned to do when she finished her degree. "Research, for now," she said. "I've been offered a place on a postgraduate program, conditional on my dissertation results. After that, I want to work on financial inclusion policy. For government? Probably not. For someone who's trying to change something rather than administer something." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a useful distinction." "I think so." They parted outside the cafe, in the thin afternoon sunshine. He thanked her for coming. She thanked him for the coffee. He said he hoped they could do it again. She said she would think about it. He nodded, as though that were a completely reasonable answer. She thought about it all the way back to the library. She thought about it in the evening while she made notes on her dissertation. She thought about how little she knew about him, his name, his profession given vaguely, the fact that he lived in the city but did not seem quite of it. She thought about the quality of the conversation, the way she had felt during it, as though she were being taken seriously, in a way that had nothing to do with her marks or her scholarship or what she was going to become, as though she were simply being listened to, as she was, right now. She thought, with a clarity that made her uncomfortable, about how different that felt from Sunday evenings in Darian's room. She met Edward again the following month, and the month after that. Each time was like the last. The same cafe, the same table near the window, 2 hours that felt like less. They moved through subjects in a way that felt effortless, but was not, she understood, effortless at all. He prepared for these conversations. She could tell because the questions he asked were not obvious questions. They were the ones that came after you had thought about a subject, rather than simply arrived at it. He was also funny. Not loudly funny, not the kind of funny that announces itself. He was funny in the way that only reveals itself gradually, through asides and the precise timing of understatement. And once she had noticed it, she could not stop noticing it. She told herself each time that this was a friendship, that this was a professional connection of the sort that Beaumont cultivated between its students and its alumni, that there was nothing in it that required her to feel the way she was beginning to feel. She did not tell Darian about the meetings. She told herself it was because there was nothing to tell. She was becoming skilled, she noticed, at telling herself things. By May, she and Darian were deteriorating in the quiet, private way of things that have already broken, but haven't been acknowledged yet. They saw each other less. He was busy, he said, with final year projects and a job application process that he described as exhausting. She was busy with her dissertation. They both used busyness as a very effective form of distance. In May, he failed to show up to a dinner she had organized with her friends. A small birthday dinner for Nadia at a restaurant near campus. A dinner to which she had invited him 3 weeks in advance, which he had confirmed, which she had reminded him of the morning of. He texted at 8:15 to say he was sorry, something had come up, he would explain later. Nadia, across the table, said nothing. Oliver, beside her, also said nothing. Henry refilled her glass without being asked. They were good friends. They did not pretend. She smiled and stayed for the whole dinner, and laughed and talked, and was present in the way that she was always present, fully, without leaving a part of herself outside the room. But something had finalized itself inside her while she wasn't looking. Some internal decision that had been forming since January, or perhaps much longer, and she could feel it sitting there, finished and complete, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She called Darian the next morning. "I want to talk," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry about last night." "This isn't about last night," she said. "Or it isn't only about last night." They met on a bench at the edge of the campus, near the south wall, a place they had walked past 100 times but rarely sat. It was a warm morning in late May. The trees were full and green. Students walked past with bags on their shoulders, and somewhere someone was playing music from an open window. She told him what she thought, which was not always easy, but in this case, she found that the words came simply, without drama. She told him that she believed they had been dishonest with each other, not in the obvious ways, not in lies, but in the more difficult way of presenting versions of themselves that served the relationship rather than people who actually existed. She told him that she had felt, for a long time, like someone he tolerated rather than chose. She told him that she did not blame him for this, because she had allowed it. She told him she was not willing to allow it any longer. He listened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I do care about you." "I know," she said. "That's not what I'm talking about." He did not have an answer for that. People rarely do. They separated that morning with a kind of dignity that she was grateful for. There was no raised voice, no harsh word, no dramatic gesture. They simply acknowledged that what they had been was over, and that both of them had known it for a while. He hugged her, briefly. She let him. Then she walked back toward the main building, and she felt the precise sensation of something heavy being set down. Not happiness, not exactly, but the precursor to it. She had a meeting with Edward the following Thursday. She arrived at the cafe feeling lighter than she had in months, and slightly afraid of the feeling, and slightly unable to stop it. He was at the table by the window. He stood as she came in. She sat down, and he asked how she was, and she told him honestly. "I ended a relationship," she said, "last week." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, in the tone of someone who was sorry for the difficulty of it, not for the fact of it. "I think it was the right thing," she said. "It sounds like it was," he said, and then, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. They had the best conversation they had ever had that afternoon. Something had loosened in her, or perhaps in the space between them, and they talked with a directness they had not quite permitted themselves before. She asked him questions she had been holding back. He answered them, about his life, about his work, about the estate, and the board roles that he had described so vaguely before, about his family, which was old and complicated and whose expectations of him were a weight he had learned to carry without bending under. She listened, really listened, the way that few people listen to him, he said. He did not say it with self-pity. He said it as a simple observation. She walked back to the library that evening, in the long summer light, and she thought about what was happening, and she thought about the fact that she had known, from the first conversation at the gala, that there was something here that was unlike most things. She had not let herself look at it directly. She looked at it now. She was afraid of it. She was also, underneath the fear, more certain about it than she had been about most things in her life. That was the thing about Edward. From the very beginning, the certainty came before the understanding. She understood it only afterwards. She did not know, as she walked in that summer light, how much was still coming. She did not know what he had not yet told her. She did not know what was already, quietly, beginning. What she noticed, over the months of Thursday coffees, was not any single thing but a texture, the texture of his attention. Most people, when you told them something, were actually in the process of preparing their next sentence while appearing to listen. You could tell by the particular thinness of their responses, the way they reached too quickly for the expected reaction before you had finished forming the thought. Edward was not like this. He listened the way a very good reader reads, actively, all of it in, turning it as he went, looking for the structural question, rather than the surface answer. He had done this from the very first conversation, which was why she had noticed him. She noticed most things, but she noticed this immediately. When she said that low-income communities faced a demand-side barrier to credit access, That people who had been told their whole lives that certain things were not for them stopped applying for them. He had been quiet for a long moment. A real moment, not a performance of consideration. And then he had said, "Yes, that's true of more than credit." She had filed that sentence. She had returned to it many times. It was the kind of sentence that meant something different the more context you brought to it. By the time she knew who he was, truly was, with the title and the estate and the centuries of it, she had already spent 8 months observing a man who lived inside that sentence, who had been defined by his position so completely and for so long that he had constructed an elaborate precaution around the act of being known, had attended a university gala without his title, had described his work in the vaguest possible terms, had sat across from her in the same cafe every month for nearly a year, and let her see him steadily and plainly, rather than giving her the version he was required to present to most of the world. She had been annoyed, when he told her, in the particular way of someone who realizes that something they thought they understood had a dimension they had missed. She had combed back over 8 months looking for the places where she should have seen it, and found several, and the finding of them had made her more annoyed rather than less, because she prided herself on paying attention. But the annoyance had settled quickly, because what it had really told her was something about what he had wanted, not comfort, not the performance of intimacy, not access to her as a route to something else. He had wanted to know whether she would be interested in him if he were simply a man. He had needed to know that first. She understood needing to know something first before you could say it, because she was the same way. She had told him yes to the coffee in March of her 3rd year. She had not told Darian she was meeting him. She had gone to the table by the window and sat down across from a man she did not know, and had the best conversation she had had in months. She had not told herself what that meant for a long time. She had said it was professional networking. She had said it was just nice to talk to someone who was paying attention. She had said the friendship was valuable in its own right, and that was all it was. She was good at most things. Convincing herself of things she didn't believe was not among them, and she had known it while it was happening, which was perhaps the most honest version of self-deception, the kind you know about and do anyway, because some things need a little more time before you can say them out loud. It was a Saturday evening in early autumn when Edward finally told her. They were sitting in the garden of a small restaurant on the west side of the city, one he had chosen and reserved, a place with low stone walls and old wooden tables, and candles in glass jars that the wind kept trying to extinguish. She had a glass of water. He had barely touched his. The evening was warm, with the particular softness of English autumn before the cold comes in. They had been seeing each other for 5 months. The Thursday coffees had expanded, gradually and without announcement, into dinners and long walks and an afternoon at a museum, where they had stood in front of the same painting for 20 minutes, debating what the painter had been trying to say. It had not been named, not in words. But it was there, clear and unmistakable, and had been for a while. He had been quieter than usual over dinner, she noticed. She said nothing and waited, which was what she always did when she could feel that someone was moving toward something important. He set down his glass. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I should have told you earlier. I didn't, and I've thought about why, and I think the honest answer is that I wanted to know how you were going to treat me before I told you how the rest of the world does." She looked at him. Her expression did not change. She was listening. "My full name is Edward James Ashworth," he said. "I am the Duke of Ravenholm." She heard the words. She understood them individually. She sat with them for a moment, while they assembled themselves into something she could hold. The Ashworths were not an obscure family. They appeared in historical records going back 5 centuries. The estate at Ravenholm had been documented in literature, in political history, in the kind of periodicals that covered the intersection of old money and national culture. The dukedom was hereditary, one of fewer than 30 remaining in the country. The current duke, the man sitting across from her with his hands flat on the table, had been mentioned, over the years, in enough newspaper columns that even Amara, who did not follow society coverage, had seen the name. She had not connected the name to the man. He had not offered it. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the candle between them guttered and recovered. "How long have you known me?" she said. 8 months, he said, "since the gala." "And in 8 months you didn't think to mention it." "I thought about it constantly," he said. "I chose not to. Not because I wanted to deceive you, because I wanted, for once in my adult life, for someone to decide how they felt about me before they knew what I am. She looked at him steadily. And what are you? I'm someone who has spent most of his life being treated as a function rather than a person, he said. By institutions. By people who wanted access to those institutions through me. By women who saw a title before they saw a face. He looked at her. You looked at my face. She absorbed this. She was thinking several things at once, in the precise, layered way that she thought when something required her full attention. She was thinking about the vague description of his work. She was thinking about the careful, unremarkable way he dressed and spoke. She was thinking about all the moments in their conversations when something he said had seemed slightly larger than the professional life he described, and she had noted it and moved on. She was thinking about the fact that she had felt, from the very first conversation, that he was someone whose full dimensions she had not yet seen, and that she had found this interesting rather than suspicious, and that this had perhaps been the point. She was also thinking about the look on his face right now, which was the look of a person who has said something true and is waiting to find out what truth costs. Tell me about the estate, she said. He blinked. What? The estate. At Ravenholm. Tell me about it. He told her. For the next hour, over a dessert neither of them ate, he told her about Ravenholm, the house, which was very large and very old, and required the continuous attention of a small army of staff and specialists, the grounds, which covered 3 counties, the history of the title, which went back to the 15th century. He told her about his father, who had been the previous duke, and who had died when Edward was 26, leaving him title, estate, and a set of responsibilities that he had spent the following decade learning to carry. He told her about the expectations of the family, the expectation of marriage to someone whose background complemented the title, the expectation of an heir, the expectation of continuation. He told her all of this with the directness of a man making a full account of himself, leaving nothing out that she might later discover and feel deceived by. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Why did you come to the gala?" "I come every year. I give to the Beaumont Endowment." "And you struck up conversations with student event coordinators every year?" He paused. There was the beginning of a smile. "No," he said. "You knocked my elbow. You came around the corner too fast." "I did," he said, "and you were so thoroughly annoyed about it that you didn't look at me like anyone looks at me. You looked at me like I was an obstacle, and I thought, that was the best possible beginning." She sat with that. She was afraid. She did not pretend to herself that she wasn't. This was not what she had been imagining when she thought about what her life after Beaumont would look like. She had imagined research positions and policy work, and perhaps eventually a small flat with a garden where she could grow something. She had not imagined a 500-year-old estate in 3 counties. But she had also spent the last 5 months in conversation with a person who was, as far as she could tell, the most honest person she had ever met, who paid attention to things, who found her interesting for the right reasons, who had, in some sense, constructed an elaborate precaution just to find out whether she would choose him before she knew what choosing him meant. "I'm not afraid of who you are," she said finally. "I'm thinking about whether I'm afraid of what comes with it." "That's a fair distinction," he said. "I need time." "You can have time," he said. "All of it you need." She went home that night and sat on her bed and looked at the small potted plant on her windowsill, the one Darian had given her years ago that she had somehow kept alive through everything, and she thought about the river in Thornwell, and the particular quality of her father's patience, and the way her mother's hands moved through fabric. She thought about the version of herself she had been building since she arrived at Beaumont, not the scholarship student performing gratitude, not the girlfriend performing contentment, but the actual Amara Osei, who had opinions about economic modeling and did not change her mind once she had said something, and who had, it turned out, been paying attention to the right person for months without knowing why. She thought about fear. She thought about the difference between fear of something difficult and fear of something wrong. She called Oliver. He answered on the second ring. She told him everything. He was quiet through most of it. When she finished, he said, "What are you afraid of?" "Being wrong about him," she said. "Are you wrong about him?" She thought about it. About 8 months of conversation. about all the things he had said and the way he had said them. About the email, the careful, modest email with the clear exit route built into it. About the fact that he had sat across from her for months, deliberately, and let her see him plainly before he told her anything. "No," she said. "I don't think I am." "Then what's the question?" Oliver said. She already knew. She had known before she called. She called Oliver because he was the one person who would give her the answer she had already given herself, reflected back clearly enough to trust. She saw Edward the following Thursday. She arrived at the cafe, at the table by the window, 5 minutes early. He was already there. He looked up when she came in, and the look on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The particular combination of hope and restraint, of a person who wants something very much, and has decided they will not reach for it. She sat down. "I've thought about it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not afraid of it," she said. "I want to understand it. All of it, the estate, the title, the expectations. But I'm not afraid of it. And I'm not afraid of you." He was quiet. "But I need you to promise me something," she said. "Yes," he said, no hesitation. "That you'll always talk to me the way you talked to me when I thought you were nobody. That the conversation doesn't change." He looked at her for a long moment. "The conversation never changes," he said. It was always about the conversation. She believed him, not naively, not the way she had believed Darian, as an act of wishful thinking, but in the way that you believe something when everything you have observed about a person points in the same direction. They walked out of the cafe together that afternoon, into the pale autumn light, and something between them had settled into a new shape, and they both knew it, and neither of them rushed to name it before it was ready. Her final year at Beaumont was the most demanding and the most alive she had ever been. Her dissertation came together in the way that good work does, painfully, then suddenly, as though the difficulty had been necessary to the result. Dr. Calloway read the final draft and called it original and urgent. Amara read that comment 6 times, and then made herself a cup of tea and got on with editing the footnotes. She spent weekends at the estate for the first time in late winter. She had not been ready before. When she was, Edward drove her there himself, without staff, without preparation. He wanted her to see it as it was, not as it could be arranged to appear. It was very large. She stood in the entrance hall, which was high-ceilinged and stone-floored, and full of light from tall windows, and she felt the particular sensation of being somewhere that has its own gravity, a place that pulls you toward a seriousness of feeling, whether you intended to be serious or not. She walked through it steadily, looking at everything. He walked beside her and did not rush her, and answered questions when she asked them. She asked about everything, the history of specific rooms, the function of certain structures on the grounds, the legal and financial complexity of managing an estate of this size. He answered fully, without performing either pride or apology. She asked to see the kitchens. He took her to the kitchens. She asked to meet the head groundskeeper, who had worked the estate for 30 years. He took her to meet him. She did not perform comfort she did not feel. She was thoughtful and quiet, and she asked real questions. And by the end of the afternoon, the head groundskeeper, whose name was Dennis, and who had a direct manner and no patience for pretension, told Edward, as they were leaving, that the young woman was the most sensible person who had been through this house in 20 years. Edward told her this in the car on the way back to the city. She looked out the passenger window at the countryside moving past, dark green and gold in the late light. "He's kind," she said. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean," Edward said. "Neither do I," she said. He smiled. She saw it in the corner of her vision. They drove the rest of the way in the comfortable quiet of people who do not need to fill silence with noise. The city rose up ahead of them, lit and humming. She thought about Thornwell, and the river, and the house where her mother was sewing, and her father was marking papers, and she thought about how none of this was what she had planned, and how some of the best things never are. She did not know, on that drive, that in 3 weeks she would take a pregnancy test in a narrow bathroom that smelled of damp plaster. She did not know what was coming. She did not know about Darian's face at the party, or the photograph in the newspaper, or the words that would be said in a room full of people who were listening. She only knew that the person beside her was honest, that she had checked and checked again, and kept finding the same result. That was enough for what came next. She would need all of it. In the weeks after the estate visit, she thought often about what it meant to belong somewhere. It was a question she had been turning over since she was 17 and leaving Thornwell. Not because she didn't belong in Thornwell. She had always belonged there. But because she had always known there was more than one place she could belong. And the discovery of each new place was also the discovery of a new version of herself that could live in it. She had belonged at Beaumont. She had found that belonging not immediately but over time, through the accumulation of small things. The library on the 7th floor where she had spent the better part of 2 years. The path along the south side of campus where she went when she needed to think. Dr. Calloway's office with its 3 books and its frank, exacting standard. She had not been given that belonging. She had built it. She thought about this at the estate. The entrance hall with its height and light and stone floor was not a place that opened easily to someone unfamiliar with what it expected. She had felt its gravity on the first visit. Not as hostility. It was not a hostile place, but as age, as the accumulated weight of something very old that had its own way of being and was not going to adjust. She had not adjusted either. She had moved through the estate on her own terms, at her own pace, asking the questions she actually wanted to ask, rather than the ones that seemed expected. She had wanted to see the kitchens. She had wanted to meet Dennis. She had wanted to understand the drainage system in the south field, which Edward had explained with some surprise, because no one had ever asked about it before. She thought about her mother's front room, the smell of it, the sound of the machine, the way the morning light came through the window in a particular slant across the cutting table, the way her mother moved in that room, absolutely at home in its demands, completely herself inside its specific requirements. That was what belonging looked like from the inside, not performance of it, not the conscious maintenance of it, just being in a place so completely that the place and you had ceased to be distinguishable. She thought about whether she could feel that way at the estate, not whether she was capable of managing it, not whether she could perform the role. She was capable of managing anything and she did not perform, but whether she could be inside it, herself. Whether the Amara Ose who sat by rivers and thought in long, careful lines and asked about drainage systems could be at home in 500 years of Ashworth history. She thought about Edward in the plain dark jacket at the end of the lane in Thornwell. She thought about him sitting on the flat stone beside her, looking at the water, saying it was faster than he expected. She thought about him making tea in the kitchen of the estate, with the same ease he brought to everything, without ceremony or self-consciousness. She thought about what he had asked her. The first time she visited the estate, he had asked if she was all right. Not as a formal check, not as the kind of question you ask to appear attentive. He had asked it the way you ask when you are watching someone carefully and want to give them room to say something true. She had said yes. She had meant it. She was all right. She was more than all right. She understood, sitting in the back seat of the car on the way back to the city, with the countryside moving past and Edward driving, and the comfortable quiet between them, that the question was not whether she could belong at the estate. The question was whether she would allow herself to believe that belonging somewhere had never been about the place. It was always about the people in it. It had always been the people. She looked at the back of his head. She looked at the way his hands held the wheel, relaxed and steady, the same way he held everything. She thought about the ring in his coat pocket that she did not yet know existed. She was going to be all right. All of it was going to be all right. She looked out the window. The city was coming up ahead of them. She stood in the bathroom with the test strip in her hand and did not move for a very long time. The 2 lines were clear. There was no ambiguity, no squinting required, no possibility of misreading. She was pregnant. She was 22 years old, recently separated from a man who had not chosen her properly, newly in something with a man she had only allowed herself to trust carefully, and she was standing on a cold bathroom floor at 7:15 in the morning, 3 weeks before the end of her final year at Beaumont University, with 2 lines on a strip of plastic. She put the test down on the edge of the sink. She washed her hands. She sat on the floor. She did not panic. She had never been a person who panicked, even when the situation clearly called for it. What she did, instead, was think. She thought in long, careful lines, the way her father had taught her to approach any problem. Start with what you know, then list what you don't know, then decide what actually needs to be decided right now versus what can wait. What she knew, she was pregnant. The pregnancy was Edward's. She had ended things with Darian more than 4 months ago. She was in the final weeks of her degree. She had a provisional place on a postgraduate program at another university, conditional on her dissertation results. She was in a relationship with Edward that was real and growing, and still new enough to be fragile. What she did not know, how Edward would respond, how her parents would respond, what this meant for the postgraduate place, what it meant for the careful, considered life she had been building, one deliberate step at a time, since she was 17, and a letter arrived in a house in Thornwell. What needed to be decided right now? Nothing. Nothing needed to be decided right now. She needed to get off the floor, make herself a cup of tea, go to her final seminar of the year, and then sit very still with this knowledge for a day or two, until she could see it clearly. She got up off the floor. She made herself tea. She went to the seminar. She sat in the back row and took notes for an hour and a half while something enormous arranged itself quietly inside her, and no one in that room had any idea, and she found the ordinariness of it steadying rather than absurd. The week that followed was the strangest she had experienced in her years at Beaumont. She was simultaneously completing the final submissions of her degree and absorbing, in the deep and private part of herself, the reality of what was coming. She handed in her last essay. She attended her final tutorial with Dr. Calloway, who told her the dissertation was being put forward for a faculty prize. She nodded and thanked her, and walked back across campus in the May sunshine, and the beauty of the day and the weight of her secret sat side by side in her body, like two things that had been placed in the same room, without being introduced. She had not told Edward yet. She needed, first, to know what she wanted. Not what she thought she should want. Not what would be easiest. Not what would make the situation uncomplicated. What she actually wanted. She was certain of the child. She was certain without having to deliberate. That certainty came from somewhere below reason, from the part of her that her mother had always called her deep knowing, the part that had told her before her brain caught up that Darian was not what she needed, and that Edward was something she had not been prepared for. She knew, with the same quality of certainty, that this child would come into the world, and that she would be its mother, and that every other thing would arrange itself around that fact. What she was less certain about was Edward. Not because she doubted him. She had spent almost a year not doubting him, actively and on purpose, watching for reasons to doubt and not finding them. She was less certain about him in this specific context, because she understood what it meant. A child born to the Duke of Ravenholm was not simply a child. It was an heir. It was a continuation. It was something that the estate, the title, the 5 centuries of Ashworth history had opinions about. Edward was a man, and an honest man, and a man she trusted, but he was also a duke, and she did not yet know what that meant when the stakes were this particular. She needed to know herself first. Completely. Before she told him anything. She finished her finals. She packed her room in Caldwell Hall, 2 years longer than most students stayed in residence halls, because her scholarship had covered it, and she drove home to Thornwell in the small hired car she had used twice a year for 5 years. She pulled into the drive of her parents' house late on a Thursday afternoon. Her mother came to the door before Amara had turned off the engine, wiping her hands on a cloth, her face already doing the thing faces do when they are glad to see someone, and trying not to show too much of it. Her father appeared behind her, reading glasses still on, a pen behind one ear. She hugged them both. She carried her bags inside. She sat down at the kitchen table. She did not tell them. Not yet. She needed to be ready for all the conversations at once, because with her parents, unlike with most people, she could not say part of a thing. They would know immediately that there was more. They would wait with a patience that was more demanding than questions would have been. She helped her mother in the evenings. She helped her father mark papers. She went and sat by the river every day, sometimes in the morning and sometimes in the evening, at the place she had always sat since she was a child, on a flat stone that jutted out over the water's edge. The river was higher than usual for May. It moved quickly. She thought. She thought about what she wanted to say to Edward and how to say it. She thought about his face, that expression of hope and restraint that he wore when he was waiting for something that mattered to him. She thought about the ring she did not yet know existed. She thought about the life ahead, not as an abstraction, but as a sequence of actual moments. She thought about a child who would be a duke's heir and the grandchild of a schoolteacher and a seamstress from Thornwell. She thought about what she would tell that child about where they came from, and why it mattered. She discovered that she was not afraid of any of it. She was only afraid that Edward might not be ready. That was the part she could not think herself around. She could plan for everything, except someone else's response. On the 9th day, she called him. He answered immediately. "Amara," he said, and just her name in his voice was enough to settle something. "I need to tell you something important," she said. "Yes," he said. "Simple. Ready." "I'd rather say it in person," she said. "Then I'll come to you." She started to say she was in Thornwell, 2 hours from the city, that he didn't need to come all that way, that they could wait until she returned. He cut her off gently. "I'll come," he said. "Tell me when." She told him Sunday. She spent Saturday sitting with her mother, not sewing, just sitting beside her while her mother worked, in the comfortable silence of a room that had always been full of that particular kind of quiet. Her mother had not asked anything. Her mother knew something was happening. She was sewing the hem of a wedding dress, tiny careful stitches, and not looking at Amara, and giving her, without being asked, the exact kind of company that required nothing in return. At one point her mother said, without looking up, "Whatever it is, you've already decided." Amara looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because you're not worried," her mother said. "You're just waiting." She arrived now to the moment she had been moving toward for 2 weeks. She had named what she wanted. She had named it sitting by the river, and then again in her old bedroom, and again on the phone, the night before Edward came. She wanted the child. She wanted her life, the one she had been building. She wanted Edward, if he was still who she believed he was when he found out. She was ready to find out. She sat on the riverbank Sunday morning and watched the water and felt, beneath the nerves, a steadiness that had been there all along. The steadiness of knowing who she was. The steadiness of a woman who had been through things and had not been made less by any of them. She was ready. She had been ready for several days. She had just needed to make sure. Meanwhile, in the city that Amara had left 3 weeks ago, something was happening that she did not yet know about. Darian Cole had heard she was pregnant. He had heard it the way that people hear things they were not supposed to hear, through a friend of a friend, a brief mention at a gathering, a piece of information dropped carelessly into a conversation, and landing exactly where it could do the most damage. He had heard, specifically, that Amara Osei, the girl from his economics cohort, the scholarship girl from that small town, the one he had been with for 2 years, and then released without much ceremony, was pregnant, and unmarried, and reportedly back in her hometown. He absorbed this with an expression his friends would have described as entertained. He was sitting at dinner with a group of people he had known since school. They were at a restaurant in the city, the kind of restaurant that required a reservation 3 months in advance, the kind that he could get into on 2 days' notice because his father played golf with the owner. He was wearing a new suit, and he had recently gotten engaged to a woman named Victoria, whose family had the kind of background his own family found appropriate, and everything in his life was arranged the way he had always intended it to be arranged. He thought about Amara on the riverbank. He thought about what a neat circle it made, the scholarship girl, back in her small town, in precisely the kind of difficulty that scholarship girls from small towns ended up in when they reached too far. He thought about how he had tried to tell her, in the soft and indirect ways he communicated most things, that the world she was entering at Beaumont was not her world, that she had been there on borrowed time, on borrowed money, and that eventually borrowed things had to be returned. He did not say any of this at dinner. He said something shorter. He told the table what he had heard, with a particular smile, a smile that his friends had seen before, and which they returned with the recognition of people who have long since decided that there is no cost to laughing at things that do not affect them. The table laughed. Victoria laughed politely. Someone made a comment. Someone else topped up the wine. Darian said, she always thought she was going somewhere. Nobody corrected him. He had made a significant mistake. He had made the kind of mistake that people who feel safe make, the mistake of assuming that safety means things have already been decided. He did not know about the photograph that would appear in the newspaper. He did not know about the name that was going to be attached to Amara's life. He did not know that the thing he was mocking was already, quietly and completely, the most consequential thing that had ever happened to anyone at that dinner table. He did not know what was 2 weeks away. Nobody does. What the people at that dinner table did not know And what Darian in particular could not have imagined was the specific quality of quiet that surrounded Amara in Thornwell during those weeks. It was not the quiet of someone in difficulty. It was not the silence of someone who had run out of options. It was the quiet of a person who is inside something enormous, and is managing it with everything they have, and whose management is so complete that it leaves no visible trace. She woke early every morning. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the pale light before anyone else was awake, and she thought, as she always thought, in long and careful lines that went from what was true now to what was likely to be true next to what she needed to do about it. This was not anxiety, it was work. It was the kind of internal work that people who move carefully through the world do all the time, mostly invisibly. She thought about what Edward would say. She returned to this not because she was uncertain about him, but because she knew that certainty was something you tested rather than assumed. And the best test she had was to replay everything she knew about a person in the context of the new information and see if the portrait remained consistent. She replayed it. She replayed every conversation, every moment of difficulty she had put before him, and watched him handle. The question about his estate, which he had answered fully. The question about his family's expectations, which he had answered without hedging. The moment she had arrived at the Thursday cafe after ending things with Darian, and told him plainly, and he had been quiet in the right way, and asked, "Are you all right?" and meant the question. The portrait was consistent. It remained entirely consistent. Whatever else she did not know about the future, she knew that about him, and it was enough to build from. She thought also about her father. She thought about sitting at the kitchen table years ago, young enough to think that problems had clean endings, watching him mark papers with the patience of a man who has accepted that most important things take the time they take. He had a saying, said rarely and only when it applied, "The wrong kind of hurry produces the right kind of regret." She had heard him say it perhaps 4 times in her life. She had not needed to hear it more often. She was not hurrying. She was not in the kind of situation where hurrying was possible, even if you wanted it. She was simply moving forward, one day at a time, toward a conversation she already knew the shape of, toward a Sunday, and a man who had said he would come. In the city, Darian poured another glass of wine and said something that made the table laugh. He was good in rooms. He had always been good in rooms. He knew how to make things comfortable, how to smooth the surface of an evening so that it moved without friction. He had done this his whole life, and it had served him well. What it had not done was teach him to look more carefully at the things beneath the surface, at the people who moved quietly and completely through rooms, without requiring them to arrange themselves. He had mistaken Amara's quietness for passivity her whole life, which was the most significant misreading of his adult years, and he was still making it, right now, at this table, with this glass in his hand. He smiled. He told another story. The table was delighted. Meanwhile, on a flat stone by a river in Thornwell, the most consequential thing that would ever happen to anyone at that table was sitting quietly in the late afternoon light, watching the water move, entirely at peace with what she knew. He arrived in Thornwell at 11 in the morning on Sunday, in a plain, dark car, alone. She had told her parents that a friend from university was visiting, which was technically true, and they had accepted this with the polite indifference of people who have enough of their own concerns to not investigate someone else's vague explanation. She met him at the end of the lane before he reached the house. She had not planned to do that. She had planned to bring him inside, make tea, sit at the kitchen table like a reasonable person. But when she heard the sound of the car and looked out the window, something in her could not wait another minute. She put on her coat and went down the lane. He got out of the car when he saw her coming. He was wearing ordinary clothes, as he always was when he came to find her. Jeans, a dark jacket, trainers. He looked like a man. Not a duke, not a figure from a newspaper column, not someone with a title and an estate and 5 centuries of family history. Just a man, standing at the end of a lane in Thornwell, looking at her with the quiet intensity he always had when he was trying to understand something. "Walk with me," she said. He fell into step beside her without asking where they were going. She took him to the river. She had not planned that either, but her feet knew the way without her deciding. They walked through the town, past the baker and the post office and the school where her father had taught for 31 years, and he looked at everything with the particular attention of someone who is trying to understand a person through the place that made them. He did not ask questions. He just looked and walked beside her. They reached the river. She sat down on the flat stone that she had sat on her whole life. He sat beside her, his elbows on his knees, looking at the water. "It's faster than I expected," he said. "It's been raining," she said. They were quiet for a moment. She looked at the water. "I'm pregnant," she said. He did not move. He did not make a sound. He was still, for a long moment that felt longer than it was. Then he turned to look at her. His face, when she looked back at him, was not the face she had been quietly dreading, not the face of a man doing rapid calculation, not the face of someone reordering their priorities to accommodate an emergency. It was the face of a man who had just received information so significant that he needed a moment to let it be real before he could respond to it. "How long have you known?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. "I needed to know what I wanted before I told you." He absorbed this. He did not take it as a slight. He understood her, by this point, well enough to know that this was simply how she moved through things, not impulsively, not performatively, but with the slow, thorough deliberateness of someone who does not like to say things she does not mean. "And what do you want?" he said. She looked at him. "The child," she said. "And I want to hear what you want." He was quiet again. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who can't find words. The careful quiet of someone choosing the right ones. "I want to be here," he said. "I want this. I want—" He stopped, looked at the river, then looked back at her. "I have been carrying something for 6 weeks," he said. "Something I was going to say before this. Before you told me this." She waited. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He produced a ring. It was small and simply set, a single stone, nothing showy, the kind of ring that was confident enough to be modest. He held it in his palm between them. "I was going to ask you," he said, "at dinner last week. And then you called and said you needed to tell me something, and I put it back in my pocket because I thought I should let you go first." He looked at her. "I've been carrying it for 6 weeks. I had it before you knew about the pregnancy. I want you to know that." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "I know," she said. And she did know, without being able to explain exactly how. She had known from the moment he got out of the car at the end of the lane that whatever was coming from his direction was not fear or complication, but something that moved toward her, rather than away. She picked the ring out of his palm and looked at it. It was old, not antique in the decorative sense, but old in the way of something that had been worn by people before, that had a small weight of meaning already attached to it. "It was my mother's," he said. "Her engagement ring, before the family ring. She gave it to me the year before she died. She said to give it to someone who would still want it if everything else were taken away." Amara turned the ring in the light. The river moved beside them. Somewhere behind them in the town, a church bell counted the hour. "Yes," she said. He said nothing. He simply put his hand over hers, around the ring, and held it there. They sat by the river for another hour. She told him everything she had been thinking in the 3 weeks since she took the test. He listened without interrupting, in the way she had learned was simply his way, full attention, no performance of it. He told her about the estate and what this meant, legally, practically, in terms of the title and the inheritance. He told her plainly and without embellishment. She asked the questions that needed asking. What were the family's expectations around the heir? What did the formal announcement involve? What was he prepared to do if his family objected to her background? He answered every question. He answered the last one with a directness that left no room for ambiguity. "My family will respect my choices, or we will have a significant problem that I will resolve in your favor. That is not in doubt." She believed him. She had asked the question not because she doubted his answer, but because she needed to hear him say it plainly, needed to file it in the part of herself that kept track of what people said, and checked it later against what they did. She filed it. They walked back through Thornwell to the house. She brought him inside, and her mother made tea. Her father came in from the garden, with soil on his hands, and shook Edward's hand, and looked at him in the direct, evaluating way that school teachers look at people they are trying to understand quickly. Edward met his eyes, and did not flinch. Her father made a small, imperceptible nod that Amara had known since childhood was his way of filing something in the positive column. At lunch, her mother asked Edward politely what he did. He told her. He said his name and his title clearly, without making an event of it. Her mother's hands stilled on the table for just a moment. Her father set down his fork. There was a silence. Then her father said, "And how do you take your tea?" Edward said, "Milk, no sugar, thank you." Her father nodded and passed him the milk, and that was, essentially that. Her mother looked at Amara once across the table, just once. Amara looked back. Her mother's expression said many things, including, "You could have mentioned this earlier, and I suppose I understand why you didn't, and I would have done exactly the same." Amara smiled. Her mother looked at her tea. The days that followed were the most unusual of Amara's life. She was in Thornwell, in her parents' house, in the small room that had been hers since childhood, with a ring on her finger and a child growing inside her, and a life that was transforming itself around her, at a speed she had not entirely prepared for. She called Samuel, her brother, who was silent for a very long time on the phone, and then said, in a voice that was trying to be steady and not quite managing it, "Are you happy?" "Yes," she said. "Then I'm happy," he said. And then, after a pause, "I'm going to need you to explain everything from the beginning." She explained everything. It took 2 hours. Samuel asked questions throughout. Good questions, the kind their father had trained both of them to ask. By the end of the call he had satisfied himself that she was all right, and she could hear in his voice the particular kind of relief that younger siblings have when the person they have always thought of as invincible turns out to be human and is fine about it. The town, predictably, had noticed. Thornwell was small, and the presence of an unfamiliar car and an unfamiliar man at the Osei house on a Sunday was enough to generate conversation that expanded rapidly, as Thornwell conversations always did, in the time-honored fashion of small places with nothing more pressing to discuss. Within 3 days, it was generally understood that Amara Osei was back in town, and she was expecting a child, and the man who had come to see her was not from Thornwell. The assumptions that accompanied this understanding were not generous. She heard them secondhand, through her mother who reported them without opinion, through the baker who mentioned something vague and apologetic when she went in for bread, through the look of a woman at the post office who had known Amara since primary school, and who now looked at her with the specific expression of someone experiencing the satisfaction of a prediction coming true. She listened to none of it, not because it didn't reach her, it reached her, every piece of it, but because she had learned long ago how to distinguish between the voices that knew her and the voices that only knew what she looked like from the outside. She went to the river every day. She sat on the flat stone. She watched the water. She did not share what she knew. She had been told, by Edward, who had discussed it with his legal advisors, that the formal announcement would need to be handled carefully, through proper channels, at the right time. She understood this. She was not performing secrecy. She simply knew that the truth, when it came, would speak for itself more loudly than anything she could say to any individual person in Thornwell, and she was content to wait. What she was also doing, in those quiet Thornwell days, was thinking about Darian. She had heard, through Nadia, who had heard through Oliver, who had run into someone at a mutual friend's gathering in the city, that Darian had been saying things. Not specific things. It had not reached her in the form of direct quotations, but that he had been speaking about her situation with the particular light contempt of someone who has decided another person's difficulty is a story that flatters the teller. She received this information and held it and then set it down. She understood Darian. She had always understood him better than he understood her, which had ultimately been one of the fundamental problems. She understood that he was performing for an audience, that the performance was for the benefit of the people he wanted to impress, that what he was really saying when he mocked her was something about the story he needed to tell himself, about why things had ended. She was the scholarship girl who couldn't hold on to the life she'd tried to claim. That was the story he needed. It made everything about him tidy. She did not feel anger. She registered the mocking, and she noted it carefully. In the same place she kept all the other things she had noted about Darian over the years, the full accumulation of them, and she understood that what he was doing now was entirely consistent with everything she had already known about him. She felt something closer to stillness, a deep, absolute stillness that came from knowing something that he did not know, knowing it as clearly and certainly as anything she had ever known, and choosing, for now, to say nothing. The water moved. The birds were loud in the trees upstream. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face in the afternoon light, and felt the beginning of a life pressing quietly against all the words that had been said about her. And she let the words dissolve, the way everything dissolves when something real is happening. Her mother had been watching. That was the thing about Clara Osei that people who did not know her well sometimes underestimated, the watching. She was not a quiet woman, in the way of a woman who had nothing to say. She was a quiet woman, in the way of a woman who had learned that saying the right thing at the right time required knowing, first, exactly what the situation was. She had been a seamstress for 26 years. She understood that the most important work happened before you made the first cut. She had watched Edward at the kitchen table. She had watched the way he sat, which was the way of a man who was at ease in the particular place he was sitting, rather than in an abstract sense. And she understood the difference, because she had made the distinction her whole adult life. She had watched him answer George's questions in the front room, speaking plainly, without the covering of status that people of his position often used as a kind of shield. She had watched him look at Amara. That, most of all, she had watched him look at her daughter. She had seen many people look at Amara over the years. She had seen teachers look at her with a kind of possessive delight that was really about their own reflection in her achievement. She had seen Darian look at her with the particular kind of attention that is really awareness of the impression one is making. She had seen strangers look at her with assessment, with curiosity, with the narrow evaluation of people trying to determine what category to file her in. Edward looked at her daughter the way you look at something you know the full value of, and are glad to be in the presence of. Not admiringly, not with the performance of admiration, just with a steady and accurate recognition that said, plainly, I know what this is, and I am not going to waste it. Clara had made her conclusion the first evening, watching him look at Amara across the kitchen table. She had filed it in the place she filed things she was certain of and did not need to revisit. She had said nothing at the time. She was a woman who said things when they needed saying and not before. What she thought, in the evenings after Edward had driven back to the city, and the house was quiet again, and George was in the garden, was that her daughter had done something she had not expected and could not have planned. She had found someone who was her exact match in the thing that mattered most. Not in background, not in the visible markers of shared origin, in the way they moved through the world, the patience, the precision, the refusal to perform. She was glad. She was also a little afraid, in the way of parents who understand that the size of a happiness is also the size of what you have to lose. But she had raised a daughter who knew the difference between fear of something difficult and fear of something wrong, and this was not wrong. Clara could see that from where she stood, and what she could see from where she stood had always been enough. She went back to her sewing. The machine ran. The morning birds were loud in the tree outside the window. In the drawer beside the kitchen phone, the number for Edward's press office sat on a notepad in George Osei's handwriting, neat and precise, ready for when it was needed. He had written it the morning after Edward's first visit, because George Osei was not a man who waited until he needed something to make sure he had it. He had put it in the drawer and not mentioned it, and gotten on with marking his papers. These were the people Amara had come from. These were the hands, and the patience, and the looking that had made her. She was them, entirely and permanently. Regardless of what address she lived at, or what name she carried, or what the newspapers said about her. She went to the river every day. She sat on the flat stone. She watched the water move, and she thought her long, careful thoughts, and nothing about any of it. Not the pregnancy or the title, or the gossip, or the words being said about her in a city restaurant 300 kilometers away, touched the thing at the center of her, which was simply herself, knowing what she knew, waiting for what was coming. Edward had not planned to come to Thornwell again so soon. He had driven back to the city the evening of his Sunday visit, after dinner with the Osei family, with the ring confirmed and the conversation had, and the beginning of everything settled between them. He had calls to make, advisors to speak with, the formal legal process of what was about to be announced to begin navigating. He had a life that ran on schedules and protocols even when everything in it was changing. But he could not stop thinking about her face when he arrived, and she walked down the lane to meet him, rather than waiting at the door. The way she had taken him to the river first, before any conversation, as though the river was a witness she needed. The steadiness in her when she said the words. He had spent many years in rooms with people who delivered difficult news, and he had seen every kind of composure, the brittle kind, the performed kind, the kind that collapses as soon as someone responds warmly. He had never seen composure that was simply true. She was simply true. He had known it from the first conversation in the gala. He had tested it across a year of careful attention, and found it consistently. He was finding it still. He drove back to Thornwell on Thursday without telling her in advance. He had learned early that arriving in advance caused her to prepare, and he preferred the version of her that existed when she hadn't had time to organize herself. That was already the best version, and he did not want to miss it. He parked at the end of the lane. He walked to the house. Her mother answered the door, took one look at him, and said, "She's at the river," in the tone of someone who had ceased to be surprised by anything. He walked to the river. She was sitting on the flat stone with her coat on, and her hands folded in her lap. She heard his footsteps on the bank before she could have seen him. She turned, and for a fraction of a second, before she arranged her expression into something manageable, he saw that she was glad. Not surprised and glad, just glad. "You didn't call," she said. "You would have prepared," he said. "I don't prepare," she said. "You prepare everything," he said. He sat down beside her on the stone. "Even this. You knew what you were going to say to me for at least a week before I came." She was quiet. "I'm not saying that as a criticism," he said. "I'm saying I notice." She looked at the water. "I needed to know before I could say." "I know," he said. "I'm the same." They sat in the particular silence of people who have noticed the same things about each other and are not bothered by what they've found. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "Because I wanted to see where you're from," he said. "I've been trying to see you completely, for nearly a year. I've seen you at the university, at the gala, at the cafe. I've seen you at the estate. I haven't seen you here. I wanted to." She looked at him. "Also," he said, "I've been told by my solicitor that there are several things we need to discuss in relation to the formal announcement, and I thought it was better to discuss them here than to ask you to come back to the city for a meeting." "You could have called," she said. "I could have," he said. She looked back at the river. There was the very beginning of a smile. He told her about the process. The announcement would be made by the estate office, and simultaneously through a national press statement. It would name her fully. It would confirm the relationship and the child's status as heir. It would be handled carefully, he said, but it could not be handled quietly. The Ashworth dukedom was old enough and documented enough that any announcement about its continuation would receive attention from the press. She asked how much attention. He told her honestly. More than she had experienced. National newspapers, almost certainly. Some international coverage, because the hereditary peerage attracted a kind of interest beyond its immediate geography. A period of intense scrutiny followed by a settling. He had prepared for this for a long time, in the abstract, in the way that people who hold public positions prepare for inevitable public moments. He had not prepared for it with a specific person, until now. She listened to all of it. She asked specific questions, about what the press would likely focus on, about her family's privacy, about the legal status of the child before any marriage occurred, about whether the estate's legal framework recognized the heir regardless of the parent's marital status. He had asked the same questions of his solicitor, and had the answers. She nodded throughout. "You're not afraid," he said, at the end. "I'm realistic," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "I'm from Thornwell," she said. "I went to Beaumont on a scholarship. I've been having to prove that I belong in places my whole adult life. This is just a larger version of that, with a higher profile. I know how to be looked at." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'm sorry." "For what?" That's something you know how to do." She looked at the water for a moment, then at him. "Don't be sorry for it. It made me pay attention. Paying attention is the reason I noticed you." He would remember that sentence for the rest of his life. He was fairly sure he would be quoting it to their child one day, and then to their grandchildren, and that it would still mean something. They spent 3 days in Thornwell, he staying at the only pub in town that had rooms, which was small and comfortable, and run by a woman named Margaret, who was approximately as interested in the identity of Amara Osei's friend as she was in lunar geography. They walked in the mornings. He met her father properly. They had a long conversation in the front room, just the two of them, while Clara made lunch, and Amara sat in the kitchen, pretending to read a magazine and listening through the wall. Her father asked him about his intentions. He said the word plainly, and without embarrassment, intentions. He was 61 years old and had taught geography and mathematics for 31 years, and he was not going to be managed by a title or the lack of one. Edward told him everything, what he felt, what he intended, what the life ahead would look like. He spoke about Amara with the specific care of a man who has paid close attention to a person and respects what he has found, and George Osei, who had known his daughter for 22 years, understood immediately that this man had seen her. Not the scholarship or the marks or the potential, her. The actual person who sat by the river and thought in long, careful lines and would not change her mind once she had spoken. When they came out of the front room for lunch, George Osei sat down, picked up his fork, and said to Edward, "The tomatoes are from the garden." Edward took one. "They're very good," he said. George nodded. "I'll show you the garden after lunch." Amara, across the table, looked at her plate and said nothing. Her mother looked at her once, quickly, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite a smile, but contained one. They walked the town together in the afternoons, she and Edward, and she showed him things: the school, the path along the river, the small market square with its mismatched stalls on Fridays. She told him stories about the town and about growing up in it, about what it had felt like to be the one who was going to leave, the particular loneliness of ambition in a small place, the guilt of it and the necessity of it. He listened. He always listened. She asked him, one afternoon, what his childhood had been like. She had heard pieces of it, the estate, the parents, the older sisters, the weight of expectation, but she had not heard it the way she was hearing the town, as something lived in rather than summarized. He told her. He told her about growing up in a house that was also a historical monument, about having a bedroom that was on a tourist route 3 days a week, about a father who was formal in the way that men of a certain generation and class were formal, who showed affection through provision rather than expression, who had loved him, he was now fairly sure, in the only language he possessed, about a mother who had been warmer and funnier, and who had given him the ring, and who had died when he was 28, too soon for him to have told her all the things he had meant to say. About the 6 years since his father's death, during which he had carried the dukedom alone, making decisions about a legacy he had not asked for, managing the tension between preservation and relevance, trying to be something other than the function he was expected to perform. "And then you came around a corner too fast at a gala," she said. "I came around a corner too fast at a gala," he said. She looked at him. Something in his face was open, in a way that she had seen only occasionally, only when he was not trying to manage what he was showing. "I think your mother would have liked me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think she would have admired you. And then, she would have liked you for making me less careful." Amara laughed. It was a real laugh, the sudden kind, and the sound of it in the afternoon air surprised them both slightly. "You're still careful," she said. "Less," he said, measurably. She shook her head. She was still smiling. They walked back to the house in the low light of late afternoon, and he reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they walked the rest of the way like that, through the town that had known her whole life, through the street where the baker knew her grandmother's name, past the school where her father had taught for 31 years, back to the house with the garden full of tomatoes, and the front room full of fabric, and the sound of the sewing machine which was, in Amara's life, the closest thing to music. She understood, walking through Thornwell with her hand in Edward's, that nothing about her life up to this point had been a mistake. Not the scholarship, not Darien, not the 2 years of waiting while she learned to recognize what honest attention looked like, not the cold bathroom floor, and the 2 lines, and the weeks of sitting by the river thinking. All of it had been preparation. All of it was bringing her here, to this afternoon, to this person, to the beginning of what was coming. She would need to remember this, in the weeks ahead. There were harder things still to come. The announcement, the press, the people who would have opinions about who she was and where she came from. She knew it was coming, and she held it steadily. The river was faster than usual for May, and she was from the bank, and she had always known how to read the water. Dennis, the head groundskeeper, had worked the Ravenholm estate for 31 years. He had worked it under Edward's father, who he described as a formal man, but a fair one, and under Edward, who he described as different, which was the most he said about anyone he considered worth saying anything about. He had seen people come to the estate over the years, officials, journalists, prospective business partners, family connections with opinions about the management of the grounds, visitors of every kind, and he had formed opinions about all of them in the first 10 minutes, which he then held to unless given direct evidence to revise. He had formed an opinion about Amara Osei in 7 minutes. He told this to Edward a week after Amara's first visit to the estate, when they were walking the south field together, which they did monthly, checking the drainage and the fencing. He told it without preamble, in the direct way he told everything. "Your young woman asked me good questions," he said. "She asks good questions generally," Edward said. "She asked about the drainage on the east slope," Dennis said. "Not as a courtesy. She actually wanted to know. She followed up." He paused. "She also told me I was wrong about the timing on the elm transplants." Edward looked at him. "Were you?" Dennis was quiet for a moment. "She had a point," he said, which was, from Dennis, as close to an admission as anyone had gotten in 31 years. Edward said nothing. He walked beside Dennis along the fence line and looked at the field. The grass was gold in the late autumn light, and the tree line, at the east edge, moved slightly, in a wind he could feel, but not quite hear. "She's going to be all right here," Dennis said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was a professional assessment from a man who had 31 years of data about what the estate needed in the people who lived in it. "I know," Edward said. They walked the rest of the field in the comfortable silence of two people who have said what needed to be said and don't require the addition of anything further. Dennis had been right, as he generally was about the things he decided to form opinions about. The estate and Amara had found their relationship to each other on her terms, which were the only terms she had, and the relationship was honest and specific in the way that all her relationships were. She did not perform comfort at the estate, and she did not perform intimidation either. She simply moved through it, as she moved through everything, with her full attention, asking what she wanted to know, saying what she thought, learning the particular grammar of a place that had its own long history and its own requirements. She had not found it difficult. She had found it interesting, which was her relationship to most things. The 5 centuries of the Ashworths were not abstract to her, because she was an economist and understood how systems persisted, how old structures survived, and what they cost to maintain, and what happened when they were not maintained. She looked at the estate the way she looked at the economic structures she studied, not with awe, not with hostility, but with the clear-eyed interest of someone who wants to understand how something works before she decides what she thinks about it. She decided she thought well of it, not of the inheritance of title. She had complicated feelings about hereditary systems that she had thought through carefully and honestly and did not intend to paper over, but of the place itself, and the people in it, and the possibility of being a different kind of person inside it than the estate had previously had to accommodate. Edward had never asked her to be anyone other than who she was. This had remained true for the 2 months since his Thursday return to Thornwell. It remained true in her daily experience of him, which was increasingly a daily experience because that was where they had arrived without discussion, at a place of being simply present in each other's lives. She thought about this sometimes, the absence of drama in the way they had arrived at what they were. The most important things in her life had always been like that: her friendship with Oliver, the decision about her dissertation topic, the understanding she reached by the river about the pregnancy. They had arrived quietly and felt, upon arrival, entirely inevitable, as though the ground had been prepared carefully and the thing had simply grown. That was the best kind of certain, she thought. Not the kind you performed into being, the kind that was already there when you looked. The photograph appeared on a Tuesday morning. Amara did not see it first. She was in Thornwell, at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her laptop open, working on revisions to a section of her dissertation that Dr. Calloway had suggested she develop further for the faculty prize submission. She had been at it since 7. The sun was just coming through the kitchen window. Her mother was in the front room. Her father had already left for school. Her phone lit up. Oliver. She picked it up. The message said, "Have you seen today's broadsheet, page 3? Don't panic." She put down her pen. She opened the newspaper's website on her phone. She found the page. She found the photograph. It was not a dramatic photograph. It was not a paparazzi image taken through a long lens in an undignified moment. It was a photograph that had been taken by a press photographer at a charity event 2 weeks ago, an event she had attended with Edward as his guest for the first time publicly. She had not been photographed before. She had stood beside him at the edge of a courtyard, not performing anything, just there, his hand briefly at her back as he turned to say something to someone on his other side, and someone had taken a photograph. She was unmistakably herself. She was wearing the dark green dress she had borrowed from Nadia at the Christmas dinner. She was looking at something off to the right of the frame, not at the camera, not performing for anyone. The caption said, "Edward Ashworth, Duke of Ravenholm, photographed with Amara Osei at Tuesday's Heritage Foundation Gala." That was all it said. No speculation, just the caption. The photograph was on page 3. It was the size of a playing card. It was next to a brief paragraph noting the Duke of Ravenholm's recent public appearances, and including the note, sourced from a social correspondent, that he appeared to have brought a companion to several recent events. She put her phone down on the table. She looked at her tea. She picked up her pen. Then she picked up her phone again, and called Edward. He answered immediately. "I've seen it," she said. "I know. I've been managing calls since 6 this morning. My press secretary has been in contact with the paper and with several other outlets that have picked up the image." "What are they saying?" "Nothing yet. They're asking questions. My press secretary is holding them. We agreed, you and I, that the formal announcement would come from us, on our terms, at the right time. I'm not going to be rushed by a photograph." "Good," she said. "When?" 2 weeks, he said. "We had planned for the announcement in June. I think we move it forward. End of this week, or early next." "All right," she said. He paused. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I'm working on my dissertation." He was quiet for a moment, and she could hear in the silence the quality of his attention, the way he always paused when she said something that surprised him in its ordinariness. "I'll call you this afternoon," he said. "There are some things to go over with you, and a form from the solicitor." "Fine," she said. She picked up her pen. "Edward." "Yes." "Don't let them hurry you. It's our announcement." "It is," he said. "I won't." She put the phone down and went back to her dissertation. Her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway, 20 minutes later, with her reading glasses on and her phone in her hand. She looked at Amara. "I've been getting messages," she said. "I know. People from town," her mother said, "and 2 of my sisters." "I know," Amara said. Her mother stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came in and sat down at the table. She folded her hands. "Tell me what's going to happen," she said. Amara told her. She explained the announcement, what it would contain, what the formal statement would say, what the press response was likely to be. She explained it clearly, with all the details she had, in the plain and patient way that was her way of saying something important. Her mother listened to all of it. When she finished, her mother said, "Will it be difficult?" "For a while," Amara said. "For us? For this house?" "Some," Amara said honestly. "People will come and ask questions, reporters probably. You don't have to speak to any of them." Her mother nodded slowly. "Are you afraid?" Amara asked. Her mother thought about it. "No," she said. "I'm not afraid. She searched for the word. "I'm paying attention." Amara looked at her mother. Something in her chest moved. "Me too," she said. The town had already seen the photograph. Thornwell in the digital age was not significantly slower than anywhere else in the country when it came to information. And by Tuesday afternoon, the bakery, the post office, and the small tea room on the square were all in possession of the same fact. Amara Osei, who was back in Thornwell, who everyone had been talking about for weeks, was the woman in the photograph beside the Duke of Ravenholm. The shift in town opinion was not instantaneous. It did not happen all at once, in the way of things people are embarrassed by. It happened in the particular, gradual way of people who need to rearrange their understanding of a situation and prefer to do it without acknowledging that any rearrangement is taking place. The woman at the post office who had looked at Amara with quiet satisfaction last week now looked at her with something that was working very hard not to look like its opposite. Amara went to the bakery on Wednesday morning, as she always did, and bought a loaf of bread, and the baker, a man named Pete, who had known her family for 20 years, handed her the bread and said, "You've done well, Amara," in the tone of a man who has come to a conclusion and does not want to discuss the journey. "Thank you, Pete," she said. She walked home with the bread. In the city, 300 kilometers away, Darian Cole had also seen the photograph. He had seen it on Tuesday morning, sent to him by 3 different people within the space of an hour, each of them with a slightly different tone. One with a simple link and no comment. One with a brief and pointed note, and one from Victoria, his fiancée, sent at 6:50 in the morning, which said only, "Is this the girl you were talking about at dinner?" He had not replied to Victoria immediately. He had sat with his phone in his hand and looked at the photograph for a long time. He had looked at it the way you look at something that changes the arithmetic of your recent past in ways you would rather not total up. He had looked at it and done the necessary calculations and arrived at several conclusions, all of them uncomfortable. He had spoken about Amara at dinner. He had spoken about her with contempt, with entertainment, with the specific casual dismissal of a man who has decided that the ending of something means he gets to write the story of it. He had said she always thought she was going somewhere. He had said it at a table with 6 people, including Victoria, and everyone had either laughed or said nothing, which in that particular social world amounted to the same thing. And she had been, at the moment he was saying all of this, standing on a riverbank in Thornwell, carrying the heir to the Ashworth dukedom. He had mocked her, in front of an audience, while she was already the thing she had always, it turned out, been capable of becoming. He put his phone down on his desk. He sat in his chair for a while. He thought about damage control, about who had been at that dinner, about how quickly 6 people's memories could be revised or managed. He was good at managing things. He had spent his whole life managing how situations looked. He had managed the version of Amara he presented to his friends, managed the version of their relationship he offered to his family, managed the transition to Victoria, with a smoothness that required very little explanation. But this was not something that could be managed. The photograph was on page 3 of a national newspaper. His own words were in the memory of 6 people who were, that Tuesday morning, comparing notes with each other over their own phones. Victoria was sitting downstairs waiting for an explanation. He went downstairs. Victoria was at the breakfast table with her coffee and the newspaper open in front of her. She was 25, intelligent, well-connected, and very good at reading the difference between what people said and what they meant. She looked at him when he came in. She had the expression of a woman who has already drawn her conclusions and is waiting to see how accurately the other person represents themselves. "She's not nobody," Victoria said. "She wasn't," Darian said carefully. "I didn't know. You said she thought she was going somewhere," Victoria said. "At dinner, 2 weeks ago." She looked at him steadily. "You said it the way you say something about someone you think is less than you." He did not have an answer. She closed the newspaper. She set it neatly to one side. She picked up her coffee. "I'm going to my mother's for a few days," she said. "I think that would be best." She was not raising her voice. She was not performing a scene. She was being extremely precise, and precision, in Darian's experience, was always more effective than volume. He watched her go upstairs. He heard her moving around the bedroom above him. He sat at the breakfast table and looked at the newspaper she had left. The photograph was visible. The caption was visible. He thought about Amara on the riverbank in Thornwell, in the kind of quiet that had always unnerved him, the quiet that looked like stillness but was actually everything happening below the surface. He thought about the way she had looked at him across tables and across rooms for 2 years, patient and clear-eyed, and never quite giving him the performance of admiration he had wanted. He had told himself at the time that it was aloofness, a deficiency of warmth. He understood now, with the particular clarity that only comes too late, that it had been simply and accurately this. She had always seen him. She had simply chosen not to say so. He had mistaken her silence for an absence. He had been wrong about most things, it turned out. That was the beginning of the longest list. Upstairs, a door closed. The woman who ran the tea room on the square in Thornwell had been in business for 19 years. Her name was Ruth, and she had known Amara since Amara was old enough to come in alone for a piece of cake on Saturday afternoons, which was something George Osei allowed his children from the age of 9, with a specific small amount of pocket money, and a specific instruction to sit properly and say please. Ruth had seen Amara grow up in the particular way that people in small towns see children grow up, not in a continuous line but in snapshots, each school holiday and summer slightly different from the last, the incremental transformation of a child into a person, visible only in comparison between the snapshots, rather than in the living of it. She had seen Amara leave for Beaumont, and come back each Christmas and summer, slightly more certain of herself, in a way that Ruth had thought about and tried to describe to her husband, and settled on as, she knows more, but she doesn't seem heavy with it. She had seen Amara come back this time. She had noticed, in the way that Thornwell noticed things, the changed quality of the return. The quietness that was not the quietness of difficulty, but of something being held. She had heard the same things everyone had heard, and had thought the same first thought everyone thought, and then, almost immediately, had remembered who Amara Osei actually was, and had revised. She had said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that things in the process of unfolding did not require her commentary. When the photograph appeared in the newspaper on Tuesday morning, Ruth sat with it for a long time over her morning tea before she opened the tea room. She looked at Amara in the photograph. She looked at the man beside her, his hand at her back, turned toward someone else for a moment, the posture of a person who is comfortable beside the person beside them. She looked at the caption. She read it twice. Then she put the newspaper down, finished her tea, and went to open the tea room. When Amara came in 2 days later for a cup of tea and a slice of the apple cake she had been having since she was 9 years old, Ruth put the cake on the plate and set it in front of her and said, "You don't owe anyone an explanation. I want you to know that." Amara looked at her. Something in her face moved, briefly. "Thank you, Ruth," she said. "The cake's on me today," Ruth said, in the tone of a woman who has said the important thing and is moving on. She went back behind the counter. Amara ate her cake. 2 other women in the tea room looked at her with the expressions of people who had been talking about her and were now recalibrating. She did not acknowledge the looking. She finished her cake and left the exact right amount of money on the table and said goodbye to Ruth and walked back out into the square. In the city, the friend who had sent Darian the first message about the photograph, a man named Carl, who had been at school with him and who trafficked in this kind of information, the way some people trafficked in gossip, not maliciously exactly, but with the specific pleasure of someone who liked to be first with news, had since become very quiet on the subject. Carl had been at the dinner where Darian said what he said, and Carl had laughed, and Carl now had a problem that he was managing with his characteristic quiet efficiency, which was to say by not bringing it up and hoping that everyone else's memory was shorter than his. It was not. The others at the dinner were also managing their memories, each in slightly different ways, and the management was taking up more social energy than anyone was going to admit. Victoria had returned from her mother's house. She had come back with the particular stillness of a woman who has made a decision that she is not yet ready to announce, which is one of the most recognizable silences in the world to anyone who has ever been on the receiving end of it. Darian knew what it sounded like. He had heard it before, in rooms, in conversations, in the specific quality of a question that was not really a question. He moved through his days in the week after the photograph with the practiced ease of a man who has decided that surfaces are for maintaining, and depths are for later. But the depths had their own schedule. They always did. The formal announcement was released on a Friday morning, at 9 o'clock, simultaneously through the estate office press service and a national wire. Edward had spent the week with his solicitors and his press secretary and Amara, at the end of the phone from Thornwell, approving every word of the final statement before it went out. The statement was short. It said that Edward James Ashworth, Duke of Ravenholm, was pleased to announce his engagement to Amara Osei, and that the couple were expecting a child who would, under the provisions of the Ashworth Estate Charter and the Duke's personal direction, be recognized as heir to the Ravenholm dukedom. It said that Amara Osei was a Beaumont University economics graduate currently nominated for the Beaumont Faculty Prize for her dissertation on financial inclusion in low-income economies. It said the couple looked forward to the next chapter of their lives, with gratitude, and without further public comment at this time. That was all. Edward had insisted on keeping it brief. His press secretary had wanted more context, background, something to preempt the questions. Edward had said that more context invited more questions, and that the statement should say exactly what needed to be said, and nothing that didn't. Amara had agreed. She had approved the final version at 11 the night before, sitting at the kitchen table in Thornwell with her parents already asleep, reading it on her phone twice, and then texting Edward, "This is right." He had replied, "I know, sleep well." She had not slept particularly well. But the morning had come anyway, as mornings always do, indifferent to your readiness. She was sitting by the river when she heard her phone begin to move continuously on the stone beside her. Not ring, but buzz, with the accumulated weight of messages arriving in rapid succession. She had muted notifications for the morning. The buzzing was the messages coming in despite the muting, too many of them to be entirely suppressed. She looked at the water for another 10 minutes. Then she picked up the phone. The statement had been picked up immediately. It was on every major news platform within the hour. The fact of it, the Duke of Ravenholm, one of the older hereditary titles in the country, announcing both an engagement and an heir, was itself significant. The specific character of it, a man of his standing, announcing an engagement to a scholarship student from a small western town, who was also a prize-worthy economist, was the kind of story that the national press did not often receive, and did not intend to leave alone. By noon, there were 8 journalists in Thornwell. She heard about them from her mother, who called her at the river with the particular brisk efficiency of a woman who has decided that the best response to journalists asking questions on your front step is to offer them nothing, not even the appearance of distress, which might itself be a kind of answer. "There are people with cameras by the gate," her mother said. "I know," Amara said. "Don't go out. Don't open the gate. Edward's press office will call you today. Do you have the number?" "You sent it last week," her mother said. "I wrote it on the notepad by the phone. Your father already called them this morning." Amara was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?"
"I'm sewing," her mother said. "There are 8 people outside the gate, and I'm sewing."
"Your father is marking papers. What else should we be doing?" She felt something in her chest that was very close to love, and also very close to being overwhelmed, and she breathed through it and said, "I'll be back within the hour." "Take your time," her mother said. "I've made tea." She sat by the river a little longer. She looked at the messages. They were from people she knew, from Oliver and Nadia and Henry, from Samuel, from former classmates at Beaumont, from her father's colleagues. They were from people she did not know, well-wishers or the curious, or simply people who had seen the statement and felt moved to say something to a number they had found somewhere. They were also from 3 journalists, who had found her personal number by means she would have preferred to examine more closely at another time. She read none of them in full. She would reply to the ones that mattered tonight, when things had settled. She put the phone back in her coat pocket. She thought about what it meant, not in the large abstract sense. She had thought about that at length over the past several weeks. In the immediate, specific sense, she was engaged to the Duke of Ravenholm. She was carrying his heir. She was sitting on a flat stone by a river in Thornwell, with journalists photographing her parents' gate a quarter of a mile away. She was 22 years old. She also had a dissertation prize nomination, and a postgraduate place waiting, and a research interest that had not gone anywhere, and a question she had been asking since she first chose economics. Why do some people have access to the things they need, and some people don't, and what does it take to change that? And none of these things had stopped being true. She was still herself. She was still the person who had come off the train from Thornwell with 2 suitcases. She was more than she had been then. She was not less. She got up from the stone. She walked back through the town. The journalists by the gate turned their cameras toward her when she appeared down the lane. She walked without hurrying and without looking at any of them. At the gate, she stopped and said, in a clear, civil voice, "I have no statement beyond the one released this morning." "Thank you." She let herself in through the gate and walked to the front door. Inside, her mother had a pot of tea on the table. She sat down. The coverage that followed was extensive. National newspapers ran features about the Ashworth dukedom, its history, its land, the question of inheritance and succession. Social columnists wrote pieces about the announcement that varied in tone from genuine warmth to thinly veiled curiosity about what it meant for the conventions of the hereditary peerage. There were opinion pieces about class, about scholarship programs, about the gap between old money and new merit, and what it meant when they converged. She read some of it, and found it largely unrelated to anything she actually recognized as her life. The piece she read most carefully was a short profile in a regional newspaper she had agreed to speak to. Not a national paper, not a social column, but the paper that covered Thornwell and its surrounding towns. The paper her father had read every week for 30 years. She had given them 40 minutes on the phone the previous Tuesday, answering their questions directly and without management. The journalist, a woman in her 50s who had covered the region for decades and who did not ask obvious questions, had written something honest. She had written about Amara's family, about George's 31 years of teaching and Clara's seamstress work, about the scholarship and what it had meant and what Amara had done with it. She had written about the dissertation and what it was about and why it mattered. She had written about Edward, briefly, in terms of what Amara had said about him, that he was honest, that he had made her feel chosen, that the conversation between them had never changed from the beginning to now. And she had written, at the end, in a sentence, that Amara kept and put in the drawer of her bedside table in Thornwell, that here was a young woman who had never been mistaken about what she was worth, even when the people around her were. Amara read that sentence 4 times. Then she folded the paper and put it in the drawer. Then she went downstairs and helped her mother with the sewing. In the city, the group of people who had been at dinner with Darian 6 weeks ago were very busy not making eye contact about it. The conversation had moved rapidly through their networks that week, not because anyone chose to broadcast it, but because in a group of 6 people, 5 of whom had heard the same remark, and 2 of whom had actually laughed, the silence itself becomes loud when the story changes. Victoria had returned from her mother's house after 4 days, and had a conversation with Darian that none of his friends heard, but all of them recognized the shape of, from the outside, the particular shape of things being revised. The engagement announcement was very quietly withdrawn 2 months later. Amara did not know this when it happened. She was busy. She was in the final stages of her dissertation revision. She was in conversations with Edward about the next stages of their life, where they would live initially, how the estate would be managed, what her own professional plans looked like, alongside the responsibilities of what she was stepping into. She was eating well and sleeping adequately, and talking to her mother on the phone every 2 days. She had a great deal to manage, and she was managing it with the methodical, thorough attention she gave to everything. She found out about Darian's engagement, ending the way she found out about most things she had not been looking for, through Oliver, who mentioned it in passing, with the careful neutrality of someone who is not sure whether the information will matter. She said, "I see." She asked how Oliver was doing with his thesis. They talked about that for 20 minutes. After the call, she sat for a moment. She thought about Darian, the first time she had thought about him deliberately in weeks. She thought about the dinner table, the remark, the look on his face in the gala hall when he had not come over. She thought about everything she had noted and stored and not said. She picked up her pen. She went back to the dissertation. There was nothing to add. The story had been told. Not by her, not in words, not at a table, or in a message, or on a phone call. It had been told by what was true, which was always going to be louder than what was said about it. Nadia had called her the morning of the announcement, at 9:15, after the statement had been out for 15 minutes. "I have questions," Nadia said. "I assumed you would," Amara said. "Starting with, when exactly were you going to tell me?" "I was going to tell you before the statement went out. There were legal restrictions on who could know and when. And I considered telling you anyway, and decided the restriction was legitimate." There was a pause. "That's the most Amara Osei answer I have ever heard," Nadia said. Then, after a moment, in a different tone, "Are you all right?" "Yes," Amara said. "Really?" Nadia. "Fine. Yes, I believe you." Another pause. "A duke, Amara." "I know. From the gala, the one where you were coordinating." "Yes. The one where you knocked into him, and you told me you'd met an interesting alumnus, and I should have pushed harder on that, and I didn't." "No, you shouldn't have. I would have told you when I was ready." Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she used in court preparation, precise and settled, "You are the most controlled person I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." "Thank you," Amara said. "The Duke of Ravenholm," Nadia said, one more time, as though she needed to say it aloud again to believe it. 5 centuries, Amara said. "Right. And are you happy?" "Yes," Amara said. "Very." Oliver's call came at 9:45. He was characteristically brief. "I'm reading the statement," he said. "Beaumont Faculty Prize nomination is in the second sentence. That was your edit." "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "I was worried they'd bury it." She laughed. Out loud, the real kind. I'm proud of you, Oliver said, simply. Thank you, she said. Both things, the prize and the other thing. They're connected, she said. There was a pause. Yes, he said. I suppose they are. Henry texted, rather than calling, which was his way, and his text said, "That is quite a Thursday coffee you had," followed immediately by, "I'm glad for you," followed by, "Come have dinner when things settle, I'll cook." She wrote back, "Yes please," and put her phone down smiling. She thought about what Oliver had said, that the dissertation and the rest of it were connected. She had said it almost without thinking, and then sat with it for a long while after the call, because she thought it was true, but had not articulated it to herself quite that way before. She had always understood that access was the question. Who had it, and who didn't, and what determined it, and what it cost in both directions. She had built her academic work on that question. She had chosen her relationship with Darian, and recognized its failure through that same lens. He had access to rooms she could not enter, and had never intended to give her a key, and she had stayed longer than she should have because she had believed, wrongly, that her own worth was a kind of currency that eventually made doors open on their own. What Edward had done, entirely unconsciously and without designing it as a lesson, was demonstrate the opposite principle. He had been given every possible access by birth and circumstance, and had found, inside all of it, that the only thing that couldn't be accessed through position or money or title was an honest conversation with a person who didn't know what you were. He had gone to considerable lengths to find one. He had found her, or she had found him, depending on which version of the story you told. The connection Oliver had named was this. She had spent 3 years studying how people were kept out of systems that could benefit them, and then she had lived, in microcosm, the same story from an entirely different angle, discovering that the things worth having were the things that could not be inherited, or titled, or purchased, but only arrived at through the slow, careful, honest work of being a person. She had come to Beaumont on a scholarship that gave her access to a building. What she had done inside the building was entirely her own. The baby moved. She had been feeling it for 3 weeks, the particular language of a person discovering that they have a body and a world to move through. The strange and marvelous private conversation of it. She put her hand on her side and felt the movement and thought about what she would tell this child about where they came from. She would tell them about Thornwell, about the river and the flat stone and the water that moved, regardless of the weather. About George Osei, who taught geography and mathematics for 31 years, because he believed that understanding the world and understanding numbers were the same thing, understood differently. About Clara, who mended things with fast hands and a slow smile, and who had sat beside her in the front room on the morning everything changed, and said, "You've already decided," because she could tell the difference between worry and waiting, and her daughter was always waiting. She would tell them that they had come from a particular kind of patience and a particular kind of attention and a willingness to say nothing until the right words arrived. That the silence was not absence but work. That the most important victories were the ones you never had to announce because the facts announced themselves. The baby moved again. She smiled. She picked up her pen. They married on a Saturday in late October, in the small church at the edge of the Ravenholm estate. The day was cold and very clear. The kind of autumn day that arrives occasionally in England and makes you understand why people are attached to the place. Light that is specific to the angle of the season, amber and low, landing on old stone and old trees, and making everything look like it has always been exactly as it is, and always will be. Amara had not wanted a large ceremony. She had been very clear about this, in the particular way she was clear about things she felt strongly, which was to say plainly, and without apology, and with the manner of a person who has considered all available options and made a decision. Edward had agreed without requiring persuasion. He too was not a person who performed comfort he did not feel. There were 60 people at the wedding. George and Clara Osei sat in the front row on the left. Samuel sat beside them, straight-backed and trying to keep his face appropriately composed and not entirely succeeding. On the right side, Edward's 2 older sisters and their families. Between the 2 sides of the church, a gathering of people who had actually been present in the lives of the 2 people being married, Oliver and Nadia and Henry from Beaumont, Dr. Calloway, Dennis, the head groundskeeper who had worked the estate for 31 years, Margaret from the pub in Thornwell, who had driven herself 3 counties without being asked. People who knew them rather than people who knew what they were. Amara walked in alone. She had thought about her father walking beside her and decided, after a week of consideration, that she would rather walk alone, which her father had accepted with his characteristic quiet. But when she reached the door of the church and stopped for a moment in the cold morning air, she felt a hand take hers. Her father, standing just inside the door, had reached out. He was not walking her in. He was simply holding her hand for a moment. Just a moment. Just long enough. She squeezed his hand. He let go. She walked in. Edward was at the end of the aisle. He was wearing a dark suit, and no expression she could quite categorize. Just the look he had always had when she came into a room. Steady, attentive, already glad. She walked toward him. She was 7 months pregnant, and she had decided not to hide it, or minimize it, or dress in a way that drew attention away from it. She was wearing an ivory dress that accommodated, rather than concealed, and she had done exactly what she wanted with her hair, and she was herself, entirely, as she walked. When she reached him, he held out his hands. She put hers in them. The service was short. There were 2 readings, both chosen by them together. There was no music, except the choir at the beginning and the end. The minister was brief and personal, and said things that were true, rather than things that were simply beautiful. When it was done and they turned to face the room, Oliver, in the 3rd row, began to clap. It was slightly premature, as the organ had not yet started, and the sound of it, sudden, single, enthusiastic, made a sound go through the room that was somewhere between laughter and feeling, and then everyone joined, and the sound filled the old stone space in the way that honest emotion fills places when it is allowed to. Their son was born 10 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning in January. He was a substantial, loud child who arrived with great conviction and announced himself immediately and thoroughly. Edward, who had been present, stood in the way that new fathers stand, trying to look capable and feeling, by his own later description, completely undone. Amara held her son. She looked at his face. She thought about the river in Thornwell, and the flat stone, and the particular quality of the water in May. She thought about the train from Thornwell with 2 suitcases. She thought about a narrow bathroom and a test strip and sitting on the floor against the cold wall. She thought about the long chain of every decision that had led to this room, this morning, this person. She was steady. She had always been steady. This was not composure. It was something older and quieter, something she had been born with and had been shaped into by 31 years of her father's patience and her mother's hands in fabric and the river that kept moving regardless. She looked at her son. He was entirely new to the world and entirely himself, and he had no idea yet what was coming, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure he was ready for it. They named him George, after her father, who heard the name and went very still, and then went out to his garden and stood there for 10 minutes, and came back inside with soil on his hands and red eyes, and no explanation required. The public announcement of the birth was handled by the press office. It was 4 sentences. The Duke of Ravenholm and Amara Osei announced the birth of their son, George Edward Osei Ashworth. Both mother and child were well. The family thanked the public for its warmth. The family requested privacy at this time. The national coverage was significant and brief. Photographs were not released. Amara had been specific about that. George Edward Osei Ashworth was a person, not a press image, and she would decide when and how he was introduced to the world on terms that she controlled. Edward's press secretary had presented this position clearly to the outlets that requested photographs, and the position had been respected. Clara Osei came to stay at the estate for 3 weeks after the birth. She brought her sewing machine. She set it up in a bright room on the 2nd floor, and sewed while the house moved around her. And sometimes she held George, and sometimes she talked to Amara, and sometimes she simply sat in the kitchen with Edward drinking tea and asking him questions about the estate with the patient. Thorough curiosity of someone who has decided that if her daughter is to live in this place, she intends to understand it completely. Edward answered every question. He answered them the way he answered Amara's questions, fully and without performance. Clara, who had spent 22 years watching people from the front room of her house, and learning everything there was to know about the difference between people who were what they appeared and people who weren't, drank her tea, and listened, and noted what she found. At the end of the 3 weeks, on the morning she was leaving, She stood in the entrance hall with her sewing machine packed and her bags at the door. She looked at Edward. She said, "Take care of her." "Yes," he said. "She won't tell you when she's struggling," her mother said. "She'll manage it. You have to look." "I know," he said. "I've been looking for a year." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, in the decisive way that she had, of indicating that something had been satisfactorily resolved. She hugged her daughter for a long time in the doorway. Amara stood in the entrance hall of the estate after her mother's car had gone down the drive. She stood in the high-ceilinged space with the tall windows and the old stone floor, in the house that had its own gravity, holding her son, who was asleep with the complete confidence of someone who has recently decided that the world is satisfactory. She thought about Darian in the way she occasionally thought about him now, not with feeling, not with the specific texture of memory, but with something like the perspective you get when you climb high enough to see how a landscape connects. She thought about the 2 years, and the warm hand across the dinner table, and the half-wave across the Christmas party room. She thought about the words that had been said about her at a dinner table while she was sitting by the river. She thought about what he had needed to believe about her, and why, and she understood it, and she had no interest in the understanding, because it was complete. She thought about him, and then she set him down, the way you set down something you've been carrying that you did not need. She thought about the river instead, about the flat stone, and the way the water moved, quick and indifferent, going somewhere she could not see from the bank. About her father standing at the kitchen window, with wet eyes the morning the letter arrived. About her mother's hands in fabric, steady and fast and never stopping. About Oliver's voice on the phone, asking simple questions that had simple answers once you were ready to say them. She thought about a man coming around a corner too fast at a gala, and a clipboard skidding across a polished floor, and 2 hours of conversation that she had filed under nothing important and then thought about for months. She thought about a ring in a coat pocket, 6 weeks of it, carried without complaint, while she took the time she needed. She would think about all of this, she knew, for the rest of her life, the way you think about the beginning of things when you are deep inside them. Not with sentimentality, she was not a sentimental person, but with the particular interest of someone who likes to understand how things happen. She looked down at her son. He opened one eye, looked at her with the assessment of a person who has not yet decided anything about the world, and then closed it again. She was in the entrance hall of a 500-year-old estate in 3 counties, with her son in her arms. She was a Beaumont University economics graduate, with a faculty prize nomination for her dissertation. She was the daughter of George and Clara Osei of Thornwell. She was the woman who had walked to the river, rather than the door, on the morning she needed to say something important. She was the woman who had never said a word about Darian Cole to anyone, except Oliver, years before any of this, on the phone, once. She was all of these things at once, and always had been, and none of them were finished. She walked through the entrance hall, through the corridor, into the kitchen, where Edward was making tea, and where through the window the grounds were gold and still in the winter light. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her with the same expression he had always had, the one she had first seen at a table in a campus cafe, when she had told him she didn't usually change her mind, and he had said he didn't think she would. She sat down at the kitchen table. She settled her son in the crook of one arm. "Tea?" Edward said. "Yes," she said. He made it the way she liked it. He set it in front of her without ceremony. He sat down across from her. He looked at their son. He looked at her. Outside, the grounds were very still. The light was the particular gold of a January morning in the English countryside, low and lasting, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look as though it has always been exactly where it is. The house was quiet around them. Everything had its weight, its age, its particular gravity, and she had become part of it, and it had become part of her, and none of it had been anything other than exactly itself from the beginning. She picked up her tea. She had said nothing, and she had won everything, not because silence was a strategy, but because she had never needed anyone to be defeated for her to be standing exactly where she stood. She drank her tea. George Edward Osei Ashworth slept in his mother's arm, entirely at peace, entirely unaware of the story that had brought him here. There was no need for him to know yet. He had his whole life to understand it. She would make sure of that. 3 months after the wedding, Amara received confirmation that her dissertation had won the Beaumont Faculty Prize. The letter came to the estate, addressed to her by her new name, but with the former name included in the body, as though the prize committee wanted to be certain she knew they understood who had written the work. She read the letter at the kitchen table at breakfast. She set it down. She drank her tea. Edward looked at her from across the table. "Good news?" "The dissertation prize," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he raised his mug. "Congratulations." She raised hers. They touched briefly across the table. She called Dr. Calloway. She was in her office, as Dr. Calloway always was in the mornings, and she answered on the second ring, with the voice of a woman who does not allow telephone calls to interrupt her, but makes exceptions for certain categories of call. "I heard this morning," Dr. Calloway said, before Amara could speak. "I've been expecting you to call. I wanted to say, before you say anything, that the work deserved it. This isn't favor. This isn't your name, which is now somewhat prominent, and I want you to be entirely clear on that." "I know," Amara said. "Good," Dr. Calloway said. "Now, are you still planning the postgraduate work? Because the research question you opened deserves a continuation, and frankly, you are the person best placed to do it, and I won't pretend otherwise." "I've been thinking about it," Amara said. "I have some constraints on timing." "The child," Dr. Calloway said, without inflection. "Yes. That is a manageable constraint. Most things are manageable, with sufficient planning. The research will still be there in a year, or two, and will be better for having you rather than someone less qualified." Amara looked at the window. The grounds of the estate were visible through the kitchen window, the long sweep of the south field, the tree line on the far edge, the pale winter light on all of it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Dr. Calloway said. "Publish." She had laughed again when she put the phone down. She was laughing more than she used to, or perhaps differently, the laugh that came from being surprised into it rather than performing it. She thought about the research. She thought about the question she had been circling since the dissertation, the question about what kept people from accessing the things they needed and what, specifically, moved the barrier. She thought about the scholarship fund she had been planning in her mind since the morning in the bathroom in Thornwell, the fund she had not spoken aloud yet, but which was fully formed, the way most of her plans were fully formed before she said them. A fund for girls from rural and underserved communities to access university. The same kind of scholarship that had changed her own life, with the additional component she had always thought was missing from the Calvert Foundation model: mentorship through the first year, not just money. Money opened doors. What happened inside the door was the other question. She had been thinking about it for 4 years. She was beginning to think she was ready to do something about it. She talked to Edward about it that evening. They had taken to walking the grounds in the late afternoon, when the light was good, which she had begun, because she found the grounds interesting, and continued, because she found it to be the best possible time to have a real conversation. Moving. No phone, no immediate demands. The particular loosening of a body in motion. She described the fund. He listened. He asked questions. When she had finished, he said, "What do you need to start it?" She had already done the figures. She told him. He said yes immediately, and simply. Not as a gesture, not with the performance of generosity, as a straightforward decision. She had known he would. She would not have asked if she hadn't known. "It should be in your name," he said. "Not mine," she said. "My mother's. Clara Osei Fund. She was the one who showed me what it looks like to make something from nothing, from things other people thought were finished." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That's the right name." They walked the rest of the circuit in the low winter light. The grounds were bare and clean and very still. She thought about her mother, sitting in the front room with the machine running and the tea on the small table, mending things with fast hands. She thought about the girls who would come after her, the ones from Thornwell and places like it, the ones who arrived with 2 suitcases and a determination they kept tucked deep inside themselves, who were watchful and precise, and who asked the questions in lectures that made their teachers go quiet and think before answering. She thought about what she wanted for them. Not what she wanted to give them. The money was only ever the instrument. What she wanted for them was what she had eventually found, and what no scholarship could guarantee, but that good mentorship could nudge toward. The certainty that what they were was enough, exactly as it was, without performance and without apology, and that the rooms they entered were lucky to have them. She wanted them to know that before they had to figure it out themselves, she had figured it out herself. It had taken time and cost something. She was glad to pay what it cost. She did not think it needed to be that expensive for the ones who came after. George Edward Osei Ashworth was 4 months old and had the expression, most of the time, of a person who is taking very serious notes about the world. He had his grandfather's brow, people said, the same focused line that appeared when something was being thought about carefully. He had his mother's hands. He was, at 4 months, completely himself. She carried him through the estate in the morning sometimes, in the early light before the day began its demands, walking the corridors and the rooms while the house was still quiet. She told him about the rooms. She told him about the 5 centuries and what they meant and what they cost and what it was possible to make of them. She told him about Thornwell. She told him about the river. She told him that he came from people who did not raise their voices and did not perform and did not quit, that he came from a schoolteacher's patience and a seamstress's hands and the understanding that the most important things could not be acquired but only built from the inside out, one careful decision at a time. She told him he would be loved. That was the most important thing, that whatever the world made of him, whatever it expected, whatever it projected onto the name he had been given and the house he had been born into, there was a love for him that had nothing to do with any of that. That his mother had sat on a bathroom floor on a cold morning and known him, completely, before he was anything at all, and had chosen him, and had built toward him, and was here. He looked at her when she said this, in the way of 4-month-olds who cannot follow words but can follow sound and face and intention, and he did what he always did when she talked to him directly, which was to give her his full and absolute attention, as though he had inherited the family characteristic already. She laughed. She held him tighter. She walked on through the estate in the early light, through the rooms that were old and large and hers now, past the windows that showed the grounds and the pale winter sky, into the kitchen where Edward was making tea. She set George in the crook of his father's arm without ceremony. Edward held him with the ease of a man who has been practicing. He looked at the child and then at her. "Tea?" he said. "Yes," she said. She sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, the grounds were still. The light was coming in through the tall window at the angle it came at this hour, landing on the stone floor, and the wooden table, and everything in the room. She put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. She had won nothing by saying nothing. She wanted to be clear about this, at least to herself. The story that would be told about her, and she knew the shape of it, the dramatic arc that other people would find in it, was that her silence had been a strategy, that patience was a weapon, that she had waited and won. But that was not what had happened. What had happened was simpler and harder than that. She had done the work of knowing herself, completely and without compromise. She had been honest about what she wanted and what she would not accept. She had waited not as a tactic, but because she understood that some things had their own timing, and that forcing them produced something lesser than what was possible if you let them arrive when they were ready. She had trusted the right person. She had walked away from the wrong one. She had sat by the river and thought, and then she had stood up and moved. That was all. That was every bit of it. The tea arrived. She wrapped her hands around the mug. She looked at her son, who was looking at the window, watching the light. She looked at the man beside her, who was looking at her son with the expression of someone who cannot believe their luck and is not going to pretend otherwise. She thought about nothing in particular. She thought about the river. Then she picked up her tea and drank it and got on with the morning.